Picture this. It's midnight. You're standing in your kitchen, the house quiet, the fridge humming softly in the darkness. You open the door and cold light spills out. There, on the shelf, a carton of milk. You pull it out, feel the weight of it in your hand, pour yourself a tall glass. The liquid is white, cold, slightly sweet. You take a long drink and it's comforting, familiar. Maybe it even helps you sleep. For some of you listening to this right now, that scene sounds perfect, normal. Maybe it's exactly what you did before climbing into bed tonight. But for others, that same glass of milk would be a disaster. Within an hour, maybe less, your stomach would start churning, bloating, cramps, gas. Hours of discomfort stretching into the night, the exact same beverage. One person's comfort food is another person's digestive nightmare. And here's the thing that should make you pause. If you can drink that glass of milk without any problems, you're actually in the minority. Globally, around 65 to 70% of all adult humans cannot properly digest lactose, the sugar in milk. In some parts of the world, East Asia, much of Africa, South America, the number climbs to 90% or higher. 9 out of 10 adults. In Northern Europe, it flips completely. Only about 10 to 15% of adults are lactose intolerant. The rest can drink milk just fine, their whole lives. So what's going on? Why can some humans drink milk into adulthood while most of the world cannot? And why does the answer change so dramatically depending on where your ancestors came from? The answer is a story about evolution happening in fast forward, a genetic mutation that appeared roughly 10,000 years ago, maybe less. A handful of ancient herders who decided to do something no adult mammal had really done before, drink the milk of another species regularly, and a process so powerful that it literally rewrote human DNA in just a few thousand years, which in evolutionary terms is the blink of an eye. This is a story about culture-changing biology, about how the simple act of keeping cows and goats and sheep didn't just give our ancestors a new food source. It changed what kind of humans could survive and thrive. It's about cheese and yogurt as ancient biotechnology, about multiple populations on different continents, all evolving the same solution independently. It's about a gene switch that most mammals turn off after weaning, and the rare humans who, through a tiny mutation, kept it on forever. And it's about the world before that mutation, when every adult human on Earth was lactose intolerant, and milk was something only children could drink. If you're using this to fall asleep, you're in the right place. That's exactly why I make these. So maybe subscribe, and before you drift off, drop a comment. Tell me where you are and what time it is, whether it's 2 a.m. in Tokyo or a lazy Sunday afternoon in Sao Paulo, whether you're in bed in Berlin or on a couch in Boston. I read them all and it's kind of amazing. The whole world listening to the same story all at once scattered across time zones. Tonight, we're going on a long, gentle journey backward through 10,000 years. We'll walk through Neolithic villages where the first farmers were just figuring out what to do with the milk from their newly tamed animals. We'll meet ancient herders on the steppes and in the African savanna, people who built entire ways of life around dairy, even though their bodies couldn't digest it properly. We'll watch as tiny genetic mutations scattered across different continents began to spread through populations with a force that scientists now recognize as some of the strongest natural selection ever measured in humans. We'll explore why this happened. What advantage could drinking milk possibly give that would cause a gene to sweep through entire populations in just a few millennia? Was it nutrition? Was it survival during famines? Was it something about living in northern climates where sunlight is scarce and vitamin D is precious? And we'll end up here, in the present, looking at a world where your ability to enjoy a glass of milk before bed is written in your DNA, inherited from ancestors who may have been herders in the Alps, or farmers in Anatolia, or pastoralists following cattle across the grasslands of East Africa, or fisher folk in coastal Asia who never needed the mutation at all. It's one of the most recent chapters of human evolution, and it's still being written. The milk you drink or can't drink is a molecular fossil, a living connection to choices made thousands of years ago by people who had no idea they were changing the human species forever. So settle in, get comfortable. Let's go back to a time before anyone could drink milk. Back to the beginning. Before we can understand why some humans evolved the ability to drink milk, we need to understand the default setting, the biological baseline that every mammal on Earth shares, including us. Here's how it works. When you're born, whether you're a human baby, a puppy, a kitten, a baby elephant, or a newborn whale, your small intestine produces an enzyme called lactase. It's manufactured by specialized cells lining the villi, those tiny finger-like projections that give your intestinal wall its absorbent surface area. Lactase has one job: break down lactose. Lactose is the primary sugar in milk. It's a disaccharide, which means it's made of two smaller sugars bonded together, glucose and galactose. Your body can't absorb lactose in that combined form. It's too big to pass through the intestinal wall into your bloodstream, so lactase splits it apart, cuts the bond, turns one lactose molecule into glucose and galactose, both of which your intestine can absorb easily. From there, they enter your blood and provide energy. This system is essential for infant survival. Mother's milk is the perfect food for babies, densely packed with calories, fats, proteins, and that lactose, which provides quick energy for a rapidly growing brain and body. Every baby mammal is born with the genetic instructions to produce abundant lactase. It's hardwired into the developmental program. The milk comes, the enzyme is ready. But then something happens. Weaning. In the wild, weaning is a clear transition. The mother stops producing milk. The infant starts eating the adult diet, whatever that is for the species. Grass, meat, insects, fruit. None of those foods contain lactose. There's no evolutionary reason to keep producing an enzyme that breaks down a sugar you'll never encounter again. So the lactase gene gets downregulated. Not turned off completely, not deleted, just dialed way, way down. Production drops. Sometimes gradually over months, sometimes more sharply. By the time a young mammal reaches full adulthood, lactase activity in the intestine has fallen to around 5 to 10% of infant levels. This happens in dogs, in cats, in cows, ironically, in elephants and whales and chimpanzees, and in humans. Or at least, it used to happen in all humans. This decline after weaning is the ancestral pattern, the wild-type condition, the biological default written into our DNA by millions of years of mammalian evolution. It's not a disease, it's not a disorder, it's not a deficiency or an abnormality. It's normal, expected, the way mammals are supposed to work. For the vast majority of human history, every adult human experienced this same lactase decline. Around age 2, 3, maybe 4, sometimes extending into early childhood, lactase production in the gut would start dropping. By adulthood, it was minimal. This wasn't a problem, because for millions of years adult humans didn't drink milk. There was no milk to drink. Your mother weaned you, you started eating solid food, and you never consumed lactose again for the rest of your life. So what happens now when an adult with low lactase drinks a glass of milk? The lactose enters the stomach, passes into the small intestine, and there's not enough enzyme to break it all down. Some glucose and galactose get absorbed, but a significant portion of the lactose stays intact, too big to cross the intestinal wall, so it just keeps moving through the digestive tract, undigested, until it reaches the colon, and that's where things get uncomfortable. Your colon is full of bacteria. Trillions of them. Normally they're working on fiber and other materials your small intestine couldn't process. But lactose to these bacteria is a feast. They ferment it enthusiastically, breaking it down into short-chain fatty acids and gases, hydrogen, Methane. Carbon dioxide. The gases build up, your abdomen swells. Bloating. At the same time, undigested lactose is osmotically active. It draws water into your intestines, increasing the fluid volume in your colon. Combined with the gas production and the irritation from bacterial fermentation, this triggers cramping, increased gut motility, diarrhea. The timeline is pretty consistent. Symptoms usually start 30 minutes to 2 hours after drinking milk, depending on how much lactose you consumed, how fast your stomach empties, and how quickly things move through your system. For some people it's mild discomfort. For others, it's hours of painful cramping and urgent trips to the bathroom. This is what we call lactose intolerance. But here's the critical reframe. The condition isn't the intolerance. The condition is the milk. Lactose intolerance is just the normal physiological consequence of having the standard adult mammalian digestive system encountering a food it was never designed to process. Your body isn't broken. The system is working exactly as evolution programmed it. You're simply trying to digest something that adult mammals aren't supposed to eat. Around 65 to 70% of all adult humans have this pattern. That's roughly 2/3 of everyone alive today. In East Asia, the number climbs to 90% or higher. In parts of Africa, Southeast Asia, indigenous populations in the Americas, same story. The majority of adults cannot fully digest lactose, but in Northern Europe, in parts of East Africa, in pockets of the Middle East and India and the Arabian Peninsula, something different happened. Something unprecedented in mammalian evolution. Some humans kept producing lactase into adulthood, not just a little. Full infant-level production, sustained for life. These individuals could drink milk at 5, at 15, at 50, at 80, with no digestive consequences whatsoever. Their bodies never turned off the enzyme. This is lactase persistence, and it's the exception, not the rule. The mutation, the evolutionary novelty. So the real question isn't why most people can't drink milk. That's easy. We're mammals. We weaned. Our enzyme production declined like it's supposed to. The real question, the fascinating mystery that scientists have spent decades unraveling, is this. Why can some people drink milk? What happened in certain human populations that overrode millions of years of mammalian programming? What kept the baby enzymes switched on? The answer takes us back 10,000 years to a world just beginning to transform, to the first domesticated herds, to the moment when humans started doing something no adult mammal had really done before, and to a handful of genetic mutations that would change our species forever. But first, we need to see that earlier world, the one before anyone could drink milk, the one where every adult human on Earth shared the same digestive system, the world before the mutation. Picture a world without farms, without fences, without barns or pastures or the smell of manure drying in the sun. No cows standing patiently while human hands pull milk into wooden buckets. No goats bleating from stone pens. No herds at all, really. Just wild animals moving through wild landscapes and small groups of humans trying to catch them. This was the world for almost all of human history. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, appear in the fossil record around 300,000 years ago in Africa. For roughly 290,000 of those 300,000 years, not a single adult human drank milk. Nobody kept animals that could be milked. Nobody had even conceived of the idea. The lactase enzyme shut down after weaning in every child, everywhere, for nearly 300 millennia. And it didn't matter, because there was no milk. Your ancestors lived in small bands, maybe 20, 30, sometimes 50 people if conditions were good. Extended families mostly. A few elders who had survived long enough to hold knowledge. Adults in their prime doing most of the hunting and heavy gathering. Teenagers learning skills. Children playing, watching, absorbing. They moved with the seasons, following game migrations, tracking the ripening of plant foods, returning to known good spots when the time was right. Their diet was everything the landscape offered. In coastal areas, shellfish and fish. Inland, that meant tracking herds of wild game, deer, wild horses, bison in some regions, massive aurochs, the wild ancestors of cattle, animals that could weigh over 1,000 kilograms and stood nearly 2 meters at the shoulder, dangerous, powerful creatures with long curved horns. You didn't milk an aurochs, you hunted it carefully with multiple hunters coordinating spear thrusts, hoping not to get gored. If you succeeded, you butchered it where it fell and carried back hundreds of kilograms of meat. The plant side of the diet was just as varied. Nuts collected in autumn and stored through winter, tubers dug from the ground with wooden sticks, wild grains gathered where they grew, though not yet cultivated, fruits and berries when they were in season, leafy greens, roots, honey when you could find a hive and survive the bees long enough to take it. Some groups developed elaborate food processing techniques, leaching toxins from bitter plants, fermenting certain foods to preserve them or make them more digestible. But no dairy, nowhere, not cheese, not yogurt, not butter, not milk in any form from any animal. Wild goats roamed the mountains. Wild sheep grazed in flocks. Both species existed as prey animals, hunted opportunistically when encountered, valued for meat and hide. The idea of capturing them alive, keeping them, managing their breeding and extracting their milk, that idea simply didn't exist. It was as foreign as the notion of farming the wind or herding the rain. And even if someone had somehow caught a wild goat and figured out how to squeeze milk from it, what then? Adult humans couldn't digest it properly. The lactase was gone. Drinking it would lead to cramping, bloating, diarrhea. Not exactly a reliable food source, not exactly something you'd build a culture around. So for 290,000 years, that was the pattern. Hunt, gather, move, survive. Technologies improved. Stone tools became more sophisticated. People learned to work bone and antler. They figured out how to make cord and netting. They developed throwing spears, and later, atlatls that could hurl those spears with deadly force. Fire management became refined to the point where groups could use controlled burns to shape entire landscapes, encouraging the growth of preferred plant species or driving game into kill zones. Social complexity increased too. Trade networks emerged that could move high-quality stone for tool-making across hundreds of kilometers. Ochre and shells used for body decoration travelled similar distances, suggesting gift exchange and status systems. Burial practices became more elaborate. Art appeared, first as simple engravings, later as the stunning cave paintings of Europe, Africa and Australia. People were telling stories, creating meaning, building cultures, but still no herds, no domestication, no milk. Then the climate shifted. Around 20,000 years ago, Earth was locked in the last glacial maximum. Ice sheets kilometers thick covered huge portions of the northern continents. Sea levels dropped over 100 meters as water froze into glaciers. Vast areas that are now fertile farmland were frozen tundra or ice. Atmospheric carbon dioxide was around 200 parts per million, among the lowest in millions of years. Plant productivity was suppressed. Game was scarce in many regions. Humans survived, but in smaller numbers concentrated in refugia where resources remained available. And then, slowly, the ice began to retreat. Between roughly 20,000 and 10,000 years ago, temperatures rose. Not smoothly, there were violent fluctuations, sudden cold snaps that lasted centuries, but the overall trend was warming. The glaciers melted back toward the poles. Sea levels rose, flooding coastal plains and creating new coastlines. atmospheric CO2 climbed back up toward 270 parts per million. Rainfall patterns shifted. Most importantly for our story, plant productivity exploded. Grasslands expanded, forests spread into areas that had been barren. Wild grain grasses, ancestors of wheat and barley, began growing in dense stands across the hills of the Fertile Crescent. Wild animals that had been scarce during the glacial period, goats, sheep, aurochs, wild pigs, they all increased in numbers, feeding on the newly abundant vegetation. Humans responded to this abundance in different ways. In some regions, people continued the ancient pattern, following herds, harvesting seasonal plants, living the mobile lifestyle that had sustained the species for hundreds of thousands of years. But in a few specific places, something new began to emerge. Around 12,000 years ago in the Near East, in the regions we now call the Levant, Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, some groups started staying put. They built permanent structures, round houses with stone foundations, storage pits for wild grain. They were still hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants, but they were doing it from a home base. These weren't farming villages yet. Call them harvester camps. Sedentary hunter-gatherers experimenting with a less mobile lifestyle. The shift was subtle at first. Maybe people noticed that wild goats kept coming back to certain areas because the vegetation was good. Maybe hunters started recognizing individual animals, tracking specific flocks over time. Maybe someone built a rough enclosure to hold a few captured animals temporarily, planning to slaughter them later rather than hunting them fresh each time. These were the first tentative steps toward domestication. Not milking yet. Not even full-scale herding. Just humans beginning to think of certain animals as manageable, as resources that could be controlled rather than simply pursued. Over the next few thousand years, this relationship deepened. Goats were being systematically managed by around 9,000 BCE sheep shortly after, pigs around 8,500 BCE, cattle, descended from those massive dangerous aurochs, were the last to be domesticated, probably around 8,000 to 6,000 BCE, in the northern Fertile Crescent and nearby regions. The process involved selective breeding, killing off aggressive males, keeping docile females, gradually reshaping wild animals into something more tractable, smaller, less dangerous, more dependent on human management, and somewhere in that process, probably gradually, probably through trial and error, people made a strange discovery. Female goats, sheep, and eventually cattle, when they had recently given birth, they produced milk. Lots of it. More than their offspring needed. And that milk, if you could extract it, was food. Rich, calorie-dense food. Food that renewed itself daily as long as you kept the animal alive and fed. The idea of milking another species is, when you think about it, deeply strange. No other animal does it. It requires an imaginative leap. To see a large animal not just as meat on the hoof, but as a renewable source of nourishment. It requires overcoming the animal's resistance, learning to handle it, developing the physical technique of extraction, and it requires being willing to drink something that for 290,000 years adult humans had never consumed. But the climate was still unpredictable. Settlements were growing, populations were rising. Any new food source represented security against famine, so people tried it. And for most of them, drinking fresh milk made them sick. The absent lactase, the undigested lactose, the cramping and diarrhea. It wasn't a miracle food, it was a digestive disaster. But they didn't give up, because humans are remarkably good at solving problems, especially food problems, and the solution to the milk problem would turn out to be one of the most important biotechnological innovations in human history. The world was about to change. The Neolithic revolution was beginning, and with it the stage was being set for the mutation that would let some humans drink milk and thrive. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Domestication was a conversation that took centuries, maybe millennia. A slow negotiation between humans and animals that neither side fully understood they were having. Start with the goats. Wild Bezoar goats, living in the rocky highlands of the Zagros Mountains, the Taurus Range in Anatolia, the hills east of the Mediterranean. Nimble, suspicious, adapted to steep terrain where predators couldn't easily follow. Around 9000 BCE, maybe a bit earlier in some places, humans started keeping them. Not just hunting them, keeping them. Capturing kids maybe. Bringing them back to settlements. Building rough stone enclosures. Learning which ones stayed calm and which ones fought until they injured themselves. The calm ones survived. The aggressive ones got eaten. Generation after generation, human selection pressure reshaped the species. Goats got smaller. Their horns changed shape. Their flight distance, the space they needed before they'd bolt from a human, it shrank. They were becoming something new. Not quite wild anymore. Not fully domesticated yet either. Something in between. Sheep followed a similar path. Wild mouflons, ancestors of domestic sheep, ranged across similar territory. By 8500 BCE, people were managing flocks. Same process. Capture, contain, selectively breed, gradually transform. Pigs were domesticated around the same time. Wild boar brought into human settlements, probably starting as animals that had learned to scavenge refuse heaps and then just never left. But cattle were different. The wild aurochs was not a creature you casually domesticated. Bulls could weigh over 1,000 kilograms. Their horns could span over a meter, sweeping forward like weapons. They were aggressive, territorial, powerful enough to kill several humans before being brought down. The archaeological evidence suggests cattle domestication happened later, around 8000 BCE in northern Mesopotamia and southeastern Anatolia, possibly because it simply took longer to figure out how to manage an animal that dangerous. The process probably started with capturing calves, very young ones, before they learned fear or aggression from their mothers, raising them by hand, keeping them contained, breeding only the least aggressive individuals. Over dozens of generations, the species shrank, became less muscular, developed more docile temperaments. Eventually, you had animals that could be managed, herded, controlled. And at some point during this long transformation, someone noticed the milk. Female mammals lactate after giving birth. That's the definition of being a mammal. But wild animals, when they're nursing, they don't produce excess. Evolution calibrates milk production to offspring need. There's no surplus. But domestic animals, especially ones bred over generations by humans selecting for various traits, they sometimes do produce surplus. More milk than a single kid or lamb or calf can consume, and if you remove that offspring early, or learn to extract milk while the offspring was still nursing, you could redirect that resource. You could take it for yourself. We know this happened because the evidence is literally baked into ancient pottery. Archaeologists studying Neolithic vessels from northwestern Anatolia, dating to around 7000 BCE, the 7th millennium before our era, they found something remarkable preserved in the ceramic fabric. Fatty acid residues, microscopic traces of organic compounds that had soaked into the clay thousands of years ago. Different fats leave different chemical signatures. The carbon isotope ratios in fatty acids from milk are distinct from those in meat fat or plant oils. When researchers analysed lipids from these ancient pots, they found the unmistakable fingerprint of milk. Someone, 9,000 years ago, was pouring milk into ceramic vessels, storing it, probably processing it. This is direct molecular evidence of dairy use. Not speculation, not inference from animal bones or ethnographic analogy. Actual milk fats preserved for 90 centuries, waiting for someone with a gas chromatograph to come along and read the message. Similar evidence has been found across the early Neolithic world, the Fertile Crescent, Anatolia, later spreading into Europe. By 6000 BCE, milk residues show up in pottery from the Balkans, Central Europe, the British Isles. Wherever farming communities spread, milk came with them. But here's the truly strange part. The people doing this, the Neolithic farmers collecting milk and storing it in pots, and probably drinking it or feeding it to their children, they were lactose intolerant. We know this because we have their DNA, ancient DNA analysis of early European farmers, people living in the Neolithic before 5000 BCE, shows something striking. They lack the genetic variants associated with lactase persistence. The main European variant, a mutation in the regulatory region near the LCT gene, it's absent or extremely rare. Some studies have tested dozens of ancient individuals and found not a single copy of the persistence allele. These people lost their lactase after weaning, just like their Paleolithic ancestors, just like every other mammal, yet they were using milk. Evidence from dental calculus, the mineralized plaque that forms on teeth and preserves for thousands of years, confirms this. Proteins from milk show up trapped in the dental calculus of Neolithic individuals who genetically could not have digested lactose properly. They were consuming dairy despite the consequences. This creates a fascinating paradox. Why would you deliberately use a food that makes you sick? Why would entire communities adopt dairying when most adults couldn't handle fresh milk? The answer has to be that the benefits outweighed the costs, even accounting for the digestive distress. Think about what milk represents. It's a renewable resource from a living animal. You don't have to kill the animal to get it. A single cow, if well fed, can produce several litres of milk per day throughout most of the year. That's thousands of calories, extracted without reducing your herd size. For settled agricultural communities, this was revolutionary. Meat requires slaughter. Slaughter reduces your livestock. But milk could flow indefinitely as long as you kept females pregnant and fed. Even if drinking it fresh made you uncomfortable, even if it caused cramping and diarrhea, it was still calories, still fat and protein and sugars. In times of crop failure, in seasons when plant foods were scarce, having access to milk could mean survival. A few hours of digestive discomfort might be preferable to starvation. And perhaps not everyone reacted the same way. Lactase decline after weaning isn't instantaneous. Some individuals retain partial enzyme activity into adulthood. The severity of lactose intolerance varies. Maybe some people could handle small amounts. Maybe children who still had lactase were the primary consumers. Maybe the sick feeling was understood as a price worth paying. But there's another possibility, one that the archaeological evidence increasingly supports. Maybe they weren't drinking it fresh. Those lipid residues show up in all kinds of pottery, storage jars, cooking vessels, and intriguingly in perforated containers, ceramic sieves. Why would you need to strain milk? Unless you were separating something, unless you were processing it. Milk, when left to sit, naturally sours. Bacteria consume the lactose, converting it to lactic acid. This process, fermentation, reduces lactose content significantly. The result is something like yogurt or kefir, still nutritious, still calorie-dense, but much easier on a lactose-intolerant digestive system. If you take it further, if you deliberately separate curds from whey, you're making cheese. And cheese contains very little lactose. Most of the lactose stays in the liquid whey, which can be discarded or fed to animals. The solid curds, the part humans eat, they're digestible, even for people who lost their lactase years ago. The Neolithic revolution wasn't just about domesticating animals, it was about domesticating their products, transforming raw milk, which most adults couldn't handle, into processed forms that unlocked its nutritional value without the consequences. This was biotechnology, fermentation, separation, preservation, ancient food science solving an ancient biological problem. For thousands of years this was the solution. Make cheese, make yogurt. Let the bacteria do the work your missing enzymes couldn't. Build an entire culinary tradition around processed dairy, and live with the fact that fresh milk, the thing that would eventually become so central to some cultures, was basically off limits. But evolution was watching, and where culture creates new selection pressures, where human behavior reshapes the environment in ways that favor certain genes over others, natural selection responds. It just takes time, and a mutation, a very specific mutation, one that would begin appearing in a few individuals scattered across Neolithic populations, one that would, over the next several thousand years, spread through some populations at a speed that would make it one of the most dramatic examples of natural selection in recent human history. The stage was set, the animals were domesticated, the milk was flowing, the processing techniques were developed. All that was missing was the genetic change that would let some humans digest it fresh. That change was coming, but not yet. Not for thousands more years. First, the communities that had learned to use dairy through processing would refine their techniques, expand their herds, spread across continents. They would build entire economies around fermented milk and cheese. They would survive famines and spread their farming lifestyles to populations that had never seen a domestic animal. And among them, quietly, generation by generation, a mutation would begin to rise. The solution was already alive, living inside the milk itself. Bacteria, trillions of them. Naturally present in raw milk on human hands in the air, coating the surfaces of clay vessels. Under the right conditions, these microorganisms would begin feeding on lactose, the milk sugar that caused so much trouble for adult humans. They would consume it, break it down, convert it into something else, lactic acid. This process, which we now call fermentation, was probably discovered by accident. Someone left milk sitting in a warm place. Maybe they intended to drink it fresh but got distracted, went to tend the fields, deal with some crisis. When they came back hours or days later, the milk had transformed, thickened, soured, changed texture and taste entirely. Most people would probably have thrown it out. But someone, somewhere, desperate enough or curious enough, tasted it anyway, and discovered it didn't make them sick, or at least made them less sick than fresh milk did. The bacteria had done what human digestive systems couldn't. They'd partially dismantled the lactose, reducing it by maybe 25%, maybe 50%, depending on how long the fermentation proceeded. What remained was still nutritious, still calorie-dense, but far more tolerable. This wasn't just luck. This was biochemistry. The lactic acid bacteria that naturally colonize milk, species like Lactobacillus and Streptococcus, they produce their own lactase enzymes. They need them to access the lactose as a food source. When you consume fermented milk, when you eat yogurt or drink kefir, those bacterial enzymes don't just stop working because you swallowed them. They continue hydrolyzing lactose in your gut, doing the job your own missing enzymes can't. Studies with lactose-intolerant subjects have shown this repeatedly. Give them fresh milk and they suffer. Give them yogurt with live cultures, and many can tolerate it without distress. The bacteria become external digestive organs, metabolizing what humans cannot. Once this was understood, once communities figured out they could reliably sour milk and make it digestible, fermentation became deliberate, controlled. You could save a bit of yesterday's fermented milk to inoculate today's fresh batch, maintaining a continuous culture. Within a few generations, Neolithic dairy communities would have had their own distinct bacterial strains, cultures passed down like heirlooms, each with slightly different properties and flavors. Archaeological evidence for this is harder to find than evidence for milk itself. Fermentation doesn't leave obvious traces. But the chemical signatures in some Neolithic pottery suggest vessels were used repeatedly for dairy processing, building up bacterial biofilms that would have automatically fermented each new batch. The pottery itself became part of the biotechnology, a ceramic fermentation chamber, inoculated and ready. But fermentation was just the beginning. The real breakthrough, the innovation that would define dairy culture for millennia, was separation. Someone figured out that soured milk could be divided, that the thickened curds could be separated from the thin, watery whey. This probably happened by accident too. Fermented milk sitting in a woven basket, whey dripping through the gaps, solid curds remaining behind. The result would have been immediately obvious. A concentrated, protein-rich food that was even lower in lactose than fermented milk alone. Because most of the remaining lactose, the portion the bacteria hadn't consumed, stayed dissolved in the whey. When you drained the whey away, you drained away the problem. This was cheese. The first cheese. Probably nothing like what we think of today. Probably more like a fresh cottage cheese or ricotta, soft and moist and needing to be eaten quickly. But it was a revolution in food preservation and nutrition, and the archaeological record finally gives us a clear picture of when and where this happened. Poland, the Kujawia region. Around 5,500 BCE, roughly 7,500 years ago. Neolithic farming communities living in longhouses, growing wheat and barley, keeping herds of cattle and sheep and goats. Among their pottery assemblages, archaeologists found something unusual: perforated ceramic vessels. Not colanders for washing grain. These were too fine, too carefully made. They had hundreds of small holes, deliberately punched through the clay before firing. Strainers. When researchers analysed lipid residues preserved in these vessels, the chemical signature was unmistakable. Milk fat. Abundant milk fat, far more concentrated than in regular storage jars. These weren't containers for fresh milk. They were tools for processing it. The holes allowed liquid to drain while retaining solids. They were cheese moulds, the earliest direct evidence for cheesemaking ever found. The 2013 Nature study that documented this evidence was careful to note what it meant. These Polish farmers were lactose intolerant. We know because their genetic profile has been reconstructed from other Neolithic European samples. They lacked the persistence mutation, yet they were producing cheese on a scale that required specialized equipment. This wasn't casual experimentation. This was systematic food processing, part of daily life, refined over generations. The curds they collected could be salted, which would draw out more moisture and extend shelf life. They could be pressed into compact forms, easier to store and transport than fresh milk. They could probably be dried, creating a product that could last months or even years. Suddenly dairy wasn't just a supplement to be used when available. It was a storable resource, a buffer against seasonal scarcity, something you could accumulate and trade. This technology spread wherever dairy communities spread, but it also evolved independently, multiple times, in response to the same biological constraint. If your population uses milk but can't digest lactose, you need workarounds, and different cultures found different solutions. Central Asia developed kumiz, fermented mare's milk, slightly alcoholic, consumed by Turkic and Mongolic peoples on the steppes. Horses produce milk with a different sugar profile than cattle, but it still needed fermentation to be digestible. The nomadic cultures that perfected kumiz also perfected a mobile lifestyle built around dairy, carrying their fermentation bags on horseback, maintaining their cultures across vast distances. The Middle East had Laban, variations on yogurt and soured milk that became foundational to the cuisine. North Africa had similar traditions. These weren't just foods. They were solutions to a metabolic problem, refined over centuries, encoded in cultural knowledge. South Asia took it further. Yogurt, dahi, set curds that were eaten fresh or churned into lassi, drinks that made milk digestible while remaining deeply nutritious. But South Asian cuisine also developed something even more clever: ghee. Clarified butter that's been heated until all the water evaporates and the milk solids separate and can be removed. What remains is pure fat. No lactose, no casein. Virtually nothing that would trouble a lactose-intolerant digestive system. Ghee could be stored without refrigeration for months, used for cooking, incorporated into religious rituals. It was dairy stripped down to its most concentrated, most stable, most universally digestible form. For populations that remained largely lactose-intolerant into the modern era, ghee became central to cuisine in ways fresh milk never could. Africa developed its own parallel traditions. Amasi among southern groups, Maziwa Lala in East Africa, countless regional variations on soured fermented milk, each adapted to local bacteria, local climates, local tastes. What's striking is the convergence. Different continents, different animals, different bacterial cultures, but the same basic insight. You can transform milk. You can make it safe for adult consumption. You can do this with technology, with controlled microbial processes, without waiting for evolution to catch up. These were cultural adaptations that substituted for genetic ones. They worked. They sustained populations for thousands of years. They made dairying viable across most of the Neolithic world. But culture and genetics don't evolve in isolation. They shape each other. And while communities were developing fermentation and cheese-making, while they were building entire food systems around processed dairy, they were also creating the exact conditions under which a genetic mutation, one that eliminated the need for all this processing, would be enormously advantageous. That mutation was already out there, somewhere, in a few individuals, rare, barely noticeable, not yet spreading. But the stage was set for its rise. All it needed was time and pressure, and the relentless mathematics of natural selection working on a trait that could mean the difference between survival and starvation. The mutation wasn't magic. It wasn't a brand new gene appearing out of nowhere. It was something much quieter, a small change in the instructions that told an existing gene when to turn on and when to turn off. To see how it worked, we have to zoom in, not to the scale of villages and herds anymore, but to the level of a single cell lining the wall of your small intestine. Picture it like a seaside town at night, seen from far above. Each house is a gene. Some windows are lit, some are dark, some flicker on, only during certain hours. On one long street in this town lies a particular house. Scientists call it LCT. It sits on chromosome 2, one of the 23 paired chromosomes that make up the human genome. That's the postal address, 2Q, written in the language of genetics. But what matters for our story is what happens inside. When the lights are on in the LCT house, that house makes something very specific, the lactase enzyme. Lactase is the molecular tool that breaks the milk sugar lactose into smaller sugars, glucose and galactose, that your body can actually absorb. It does its work right at the brush border of the small intestine, at the surface of those tiny finger-like villi that grab nutrients as food passes by. In babies, the LCT house blazes with light. The gene is wide open, working almost around the clock. That makes sense. For a newborn mammal, milk is not a luxury, it's everything. No milk, no survival, so natural selection made sure infant intestines are full of lactase. Every drop of milk can be broken down, every calorie captured. But for most mammals, and for most humans throughout our history, that bright light is temporary. After weaning, the village starts to dim, curtains are drawn, lamps are turned down. Gradually, LCT activity falls. The lactase enzyme is still perfectly designed, still capable of doing its job, but the body simply stops making much of it. By adolescence, for the majority of people in most times and places, the LCT house is a quiet, dark building at the edge of town. The gene is still there, still intact. The blueprint for lactase hasn't changed. What's changed is the schedule, the hours, the decision about whether this house should keep its lights on into adulthood. That decision doesn't happen inside the house itself. It happens at the electrical box, at the dimmer switch. Genes rarely act alone. Around each gene are stretches of DNA whose job is not to build proteins, but to control when protein building happens. You can think of the LCT gene as a lamp, and these nearby regions as the hand turning the dial. Turn it up in infancy, turn it down after weaning. In most mammals, that's the default. The surprise of lactase persistence is that the lamp didn't change. The bulb, the wiring, the design of the lactase enzyme itself, all of that stayed the same. What changed was the dimmer switch. If we move just upstream of the LCT house, we find another gene sitting next door, MCM6. It does its own unrelated work in the cell, but hidden inside one of its long non-coding stretches, in what geneticists call an intron, lies a control panel, a piece of DNA that acts like an enhancer for LCT, a switchboard that tells the intestine cells how brightly to keep the lactase lamp burning, and for how long. Somewhere in that control panel, a single letter in the DNA alphabet flipped. In the European version of this story, that letter sits about 13,910 bases upstream of the start of LCT. Scientists label it minus 13,910. At that spot, in most of our ancestors, the DNA carried a C. In some person, at some point in the last 10,000 years or so, a copying error during reproduction changed that C to a T, C to T. 1 letter out of 3 billion in the human genome. If you wrote your entire genetic code out as a book, page after page of A, C, G, and T, this mutation would be one tiny character on one page near the very end of one chapter, easy to overlook. Yet that tiny shift altered how the enhancer worked. In lab experiments where scientists attach this enhancer region to a reporter gene, they can literally see the difference. The version with the C, the ancestral allele, lets the LCT lamp turn down after childhood, as it always had. The version with the T, the 13,910 T variant, keeps the dimmer turned up. Not blazing like in a newborn, but high enough that substantial amounts of lactase continue to be made throughout adult life. From the point of view of your intestine, nothing exotic is happening. There's no super enzyme, no new biochemical trick. The same lactase appears on the surface of the cells. The only question is there enough of it? Do the lights in the LCT house stay on, or do they go dark? For people with the minus 13,910 T mutation, the answer is they stay on. The lamp burns through adulthood, quietly doing its job every time milk passes by. What makes this especially powerful in evolutionary terms is how the trait is inherited. Lactase persistence, the ability to keep digesting lactose as an adult, behaves as a dominant trait in most study populations. That means you don't need 2 copies of the light-on version. 1 is usually enough. Imagine you have 2 copies of that enhancer region, 1 on each chromosome, 2 you inherited from your parents. If both copies carry the ancestral C, the LCT dimmer will typically slide down after childhood. If one copy carries the T and the other the C, the T version still strengthens the signal enough that your intestine keeps making lactase. If both copies carry the T, the effect is similar or sometimes slightly stronger, but from a practical standpoint, CT and TT individuals are both generally milk drinkers. Only CC tends to be the classic lactose-intolerant adult pattern. From the level of the population, this matters. In a world where milk is a major resource, a single T from one parent can give a child the ability to drink it lifelong. That means you don't need every person in a family or every person in a village to be homozygous for the mutation. The advantage spreads rapidly because just one copy of the new switch setting can transform someone's diet. This is why geneticists describe lactase persistence not as a change in the LCT gene itself, but as a regulatory mutation. The blueprint remains the same. The factory is unchanged. What differs is the management policy. Do we keep the factory open after the early childhood shift? Or do we close it down and let the building sit idle? To see the contrast, consider a much rarer condition called congenital lactase deficiency. In those unlucky infants, the mutations are right inside the LCT house. The blueprint for lactase is damaged. The enzyme is misbuilt or not produced at all. That's a structural problem. No matter how much you press the switch, no working lamp will ever come on. Adult lactase non-persistence. The normal pattern where lactase fades after weaning is the opposite. The structure is fine, the house is well built. But the town council has passed a rule. After a certain age, the lights must go out. The minus 13,910 T mutation, and others like it in neighbouring regions of MCM6, are amendments to that rule. Quiet, precise, and enormously consequential. And Europe is only one chapter. In East Africa, the Middle East, and parts of Arabia, other groups of herders found themselves in the same evolutionary situation, surrounded by milk, mostly unable to drink it fresh as adults. In those places, different single-letter changes arose in the same general control region, at minus 13,907, minus 13,915, minus 14,009, minus 14,010, even further upstream around minus 22,018. Different dials on the same switchboard, each tuned in its own way to keep the LCT lamp glowing longer. But that's a story for the next section. For now, the essential point is this. The great human divide between those who can drink milk in adulthood and those who cannot is not a tale of completely different bodies. It is a story of timing, of a gene that all of us share, controlled by switches that only some of us carry. Under a microscope, the intestines of a milk-drinking adult and a lactose-intolerant adult look remarkably similar. The same villi, the same cells, the same LCT house standing on chromosome 2. The difference lies in a few scattered letters, far from the gene itself, that whisper to the DNA, "Keep going. Don't turn out the lights yet. There's still milk to drink." Once dairying cultures began to spread, those whispers became powerful. In Neolithic villages, on windswept African savannas, in the pastures of Arabia and the plains of northern Europe, anyone whose switch stayed on had an edge. More calories in winter, safer fluids when water was foul, extra nutrition for children and pregnant women. Over thousands of years, the tiny T at minus 13,910 and its cousins in other regions would ride that advantage, generation after generation, turning a quiet regulatory tweak into one of the most visible genetic differences on the modern human map. The lamp was the same everywhere. The milk was the same. What changed, again and again, was who got to keep the light. If this were a simple story, it would end there. One tiny T at minus 13,910 appears in some early herder in Europe. They can drink milk. Their children do better. The mutation spreads, and eventually you get Scandinavians happily pouring cream on everything. But human evolution almost never writes such neat, single-threaded tales. When geneticists started asking a very simple question, do all milk-drinking adults have the same mutation? The answer came back as a quiet, resounding number. The first surprise came from Africa. Researchers working with pastoralist groups in East Africa, people whose lives have revolved around cattle and milk for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, did the obvious test. they checked for the European -13,910 T switch. In some groups that drank milk regularly, they found it, especially in communities with known historical contact with Europeans or Near Eastern farmers. The T was there, riding in on ancient marriages and migrations. But in others, especially among certain cattle herders in Kenya and Tanzania, people could drink large amounts of fresh milk as adults. And yet the classic European mutation was absent. Completely absent in some families, very rare in others. Something else was holding the LCT dimmer up. So the researchers zoomed in on the same control region, that intron inside the neighbouring MCM6 gene, and began scanning, letter by letter. What they found reads like a small constellation of alternative solutions. At position -13,907, a C had changed to a G in some lineages. In others, at -13,915, a T had flipped to a G. Still further away, around -14,009 and -14,010 bases upstream of LCT, other single-letter changes appeared. Different points on the same stretch of DNA, each quietly modifying how strongly the enhancer told the intestine to keep making lactase. In functional tests, when scientists put these variants into intestinal cells in the lab, many of them behaved like cousins of the European T. They boosted the activity of the LCT promoter. They kept the lamp burning. And the pattern wasn't random. The 14,010 G variant, for example, shows up again and again among East African pastoralists whose wealth is counted in cattle. Groups like the Maasai, the Tutsi, and neighbouring herding peoples. The 13,907 G change is found in some Afro-Asiatic-speaking populations in northeast Africa and the Middle East, where goats and sheep have been milked for millennia. The 13,915 G variant appears at notable frequencies on the Arabian Peninsula and in some North and East African communities with a long history of camel herding and desert pastoralism. The 14,009 G variant turns up in a mosaic of Northeast African and Arab groups, threaded through societies where fresh milk has long been part of everyday life. Different herds, different landscapes, different histories, the same biological question. Imagine a mountain ridge in the dark. Rain starts to fall on its summit. The water has to get down somehow. It can't sit on the peak forever. Gravity demands motion. But when you come back later, you don't find one single carved channel, one official river ordained by the landscape. You find many. Thin rivulets cutting through rock in parallel. Small streams that began separately, weaving and branching, sometimes merging, sometimes running alone, all seeking the same valley floor. This is what convergent evolution looks like. Convergent evolution is the name biologists give to the process where different populations, or even different species facing similar pressures, independently arrive at similar solutions. Not because they share a recent common mutation, but because the environment is asking the same question in many places, and there are only so many good answers. Bats and birds both fly, but their wings are built on different blueprints. Sharks and dolphins both slice through water with streamlined bodies, but one is a fish, the other a mammal. Cacti in the Americas and some spurges in Africa both wear spines and store water, yet their last common ancestor was an unremarkable, non-succulent plant. With lactase persistence, the convergence happens not in bones or feathers, but in a handful of letters in our DNA. In Europe, the -13,910 T river began to cut its channel. In East Africa, the 14,010 G river did the same. In Arabia, 13,915 G began yet another path. At least 5 main streams, 13,910 T, 13,907 G, 13,915 G, 14,009 G, 14,010 G, have been clearly identified so far, and genetic mismatches in some African milk-drinking groups suggest there are more small channels still hidden in the dark, waiting to be mapped. Each of these changes sits on a different genetic background. When scientists examine the stretches of DNA surrounding them, the patterns are distinct, like different regional dialects in the same language. That tells us these mutations did not all spread from one miraculous ancestor. They popped up separately at different times, in different populations, and then were amplified by the same cultural habit, milking animals and drinking their fresh milk. Think of those Neolithic and later herding societies as different villages scattered around the mountain slopes. In one, in the damp grasslands of northern Europe, people tether cattle in wooden byres and fill clay pots with cow's milk. In another, further south and east, families lead mixed herds of goats and sheep through rocky hills, milking them in stone pens before dawn. On the hot open plains of East Africa, tall herders guide longhorn cattle across savannas, sharing gourds of milk and blood. In the dry deserts of Arabia, lean camels kneel by low tents, their milk a lifeline in a water-poor world. The animals differ, the climate differs, the languages, the songs, the rituals, all their own. But in all of these worlds, one quiet pattern repeats. Milk is available, often daily. It is rich in calories, proteins, fats, sugars, and micronutrients. It is produced on legs, able to walk to where people are, even when crops fail or rivers shrink. It is, for these cultures, too valuable to waste. If you happen to carry a switch that lets you drink that milk as an adult without distress, you gain a small edge. In times of abundance, you can put away a little more energy. In times of scarcity, when harvests fail or herds thin, you can rely on an extra food source that others can't fully use. For children and pregnant women, for people fighting infection or enduring long journeys, that advantage can translate into survival and into healthy offspring. Now imagine this playing out not just in one village but in dozens over hundreds of years. In northern Europe, the -13,910 T variant rises, generation after generation, among people who already make cheese and yogurt, but who now can drink fresh milk as well. In East Africa, the -14,010 G variant spreads through cattle camps where milk is given to warriors and children. In Arabia, -13,915 G walks with camel caravans across the Red Sea and back, carried by families whose lives are bound to their herds. Selection doesn't care which letter changed. It cares about the outcome, a LCT switch that doesn't turn fully down after weaning. The convergence here is not a single mutation washing over the globe, but a pattern of similar mutations being rewarded wherever milk and pastoralism took root strongly enough and long enough to matter. This is why many geneticists point to lactose persistence as one of the clearest examples of gene-culture coevolution in our species. Culture, in this case the cultural choice to domesticate animals and to value their milk, created a new kind of environment. A world where a strange, historically rare behavior for mammals became normal, adults drinking milk from another species. That cultural environment then reached back down into the genome, favoring any variation that made this practice easier. Gene culture coevolution is a feedback loop. People start herding cattle, goats, sheep, camels. Milk becomes common. A random child is born with a small change in their LCT control panel that keeps lactase high. That child can drink more milk. Perhaps they survive a famine that kills others, or recover faster from disease, or bear more surviving children. Those children inherit both the mutation and the culture. The habit of milking, the knowledge of how to care for herds. The culture then further amplifies the advantage of the gene. The loop tightens. In places without that loop, the old pattern holds. In much of East Asia, where traditional cuisines leaned heavily on grains, legumes, vegetables, and later soy-based products, and where large-scale milk pastoralism played a smaller role, there was little sustained pressure to keep lactase on. The ancestral C at minus 13,910 and its neighbours could continue their ancient habit of dimming the lamp after childhood. And they did. So when you look at a modern map of lactose tolerance, you're not seeing the footprint of one heroic mutation. You're looking at a patchwork quilt stitched together by many small changes, each responding to local ways of life. High frequencies of minus 13,910 T across northern Europe and into some North African groups with herding histories, pockets of minus 13,907 G, minus 13,915 G, minus 14,009 G, and minus 14,010 G across the Horn of Africa, the Nile Corridor, the Rift Valleys, and the Arabian deserts. Low overall persistence where dairying never took deep root or took different forms, like fermenting milk into yogurt and cheese, that even non-persistent people can tolerate in moderation. At least 5 independent genetic yes answers to the question, shall we keep drinking milk as adults? And likely more, still hiding in understudied valleys and unsequenced genomes. All of them written not in the protein-coding heart of the LCT gene, but in the fine print of its regulations. Margins and footnotes edited separately by distant peoples who never met, yet faced echoes of the same choice. Tonight, if you sip a glass of milk or spoon up some yogurt before bed, you're participating in that long conversation between culture and genes. Your ancestors or someone else's carved one of those rivers down the mountain. They turned a baby enzyme into a lifelong companion, not once, but again and again, wherever herds and humans walk together. In the next part of our story, we'll follow one of those rivers in detail, the European stream, from the first hesitant farmers to the medieval milk drinkers who helped shape the modern myth that everyone in the West can handle a tall glass of milk. To follow the European river, we have to step back about 9,000 years to a time when Europe was still mostly a continent of forests and foragers. Imagine the shorelines of the Aegean, the low hills of western Anatolia, small villages of mud brick and timber, barley and wheat in neat plots, goats, sheep, and a few sturdy cattle penned at night behind woven fences. These are the descendants of Near Eastern farmers, people whose ancestors had already spent millennia experimenting with crops and livestock in the Fertile Crescent. Sometime around 7000 BCE, some of these farming families began to move, not in one big migration, but in slow generational steps. A daughter marries into a village a few valleys away. A son and his cousins push their herds toward fresh pastures. A group loads grain and tools into boats and follows the coastline. Over centuries, the wave of farming culture seeps out of Anatolia into the Balkans, and then, like fingers of a hand, spreads up the great river corridors of Europe. Along the Danube and its tributaries, a distinctive style of life and pottery appears, what archaeologists call linear band ceramic, or LBK for short. Farmers living in long timber houses, cutting clearings in the forest, planting fields and tending cattle, sheep and goats. Further north, across what is now Germany, Poland and Scandinavia, another culture takes shape a little later, the funnel beaker culture, named for their inverted cone pots. Everywhere this new way of life arrives, the same pattern repeats. Forests are burned or cleared, fields are laid out, herds are raised, and, importantly for our story, milk is being used. We know this not because anyone wrote it down, writing is still thousands of years in the future here, but because of what clung invisibly to the walls of their pottery. When archaeologists chemically analyze those Neolithic sherds, they find the ghostly fingerprints of fat molecules. Some of those molecules match the distinctive profile of milk from cows, sheep or goats in LBK pottery from Central Europe. in funnel beaker vessels and perforated ceramic sieves from around the 6th millennium BCE in northern Europe. Those sieves, with their neat rows of small holes, puzzled people at first. Then the lipid residues told their story. They'd been soaked in milk fats, likely used to strain curds from whey. In other words, to make cheese. Early, widespread milk processing, thousands of years before anyone in Europe could reliably drink a mug of fresh milk without consequences. Because here comes the twist. When geneticists managed to pull DNA from the skeletons of those same early European farmers, people from LBK villages in Germany, from Neolithic sites in Hungary and Spain, they went straight to the now famous switch at -13,910, and they found almost nothing. Again and again, the ancient genomes carried the ancestral C at that position, not the lactase-persistent T. In many early farming samples dated between roughly 6,000 and 4,000 BCE, the -13,910 T mutation is absent, or present at such low frequencies that, on the scale of whole communities, almost everyone would have been lactose non-persistent. Adult intestines dimming the lactase lamp down after weaning, just as mammals have done for tens of millions of years. So the picture is a little paradoxical when you first see it. In the fields and byres, cattle low quietly. In the pottery, milk is being processed, its fats soaked into clay. Yet in the bones of the people themselves, the genetic signature says, these were, overwhelmingly, lactose-intolerant adults. To live in one of those longhouses in an LBK village was to live in a world where milk was valuable, but raw milk was a problem for most grown-ups. The solution was fermentation and processing, turning fresh milk into yogurt, kefir-like drinks, and especially cheese. All of these reduce lactose, either by letting bacteria eat much of it, or by separating out the whey, where most of the sugar resides. The Neolithic Europeans were, in this sense, doing biotechnology before anyone knew the word. They'd figured out how to turn an almost useless liquid for adults into portable, storable, digestible food. And yet, somewhere within this milky landscape, the T at -13,910 did appear. We don't know the exact first cradle of that mutation, but many models point to somewhere in or near the lands these early farmers occupied. Perhaps in the Balkans, perhaps in Central Europe. Sometime in the last 7,500 years or so. At first it would have been just one letter among many billions in a single child. A tiny accident on the MCM6 enhancer that happened to keep the LCT dimmer turned up. For a long time, nothing dramatic seems to happen. The ancient DNA record from the early and middle Neolithic still shows almost total dominance of the lactose-intolerant version. If the T was present, it was hiding in the background, a small stream not yet cutting a deep channel. Then, much later, the genetic record changes character. As we move forward in time into the late Neolithic, the Copper Age, the Bronze Age, and beyond, the frequency of -13,910 T starts to climb. By the time we reach Iron Age and medieval cemeteries in parts of Central and Northern Europe, that once rare T has become common. In one German medieval sample around 1200 CE, roughly 3 out of 4 people already carry lactose-persistent genotypes, very close to modern levels in that region. To go from almost zero to majority in just a few thousand years is fast by evolutionary standards. Models that try to match the observed rise in frequency often require very strong positive selection. Some estimates put the selection coefficient for lactase persistence in Europeans among the strongest documented for any human genetic variant in recent millennia. That's like evolution stepping hard on the gas pedal. Why did this happen when it did? That's still debated. We'll explore the leading ideas in the next section. For now, it's enough to notice the timing puzzle. Milk has been in the European diet since at least 7,000 to 6,000 BCE, but the genetic ability to drink it raw as an adult seems to have surged only in the last 5,000 to 3,000 years. For thousands of years, then, Europe was full of people milking animals and making cheese, whose guts behaved, for the most part, like those of any other mammal. Only gradually did a different pattern spread. Adults who could pour milk straight from the animal into a cup and digest it as easily as a child. As the centuries turned into millennia, this genetic river didn't spread evenly. If you map modern lactase persistence across Europe, you don't see a flat plateau, you see a slope. In the far north and northwest, in Ireland and Britain, in Denmark, Sweden and their neighbours, somewhere around 90 to 95% of adults can usually drink milk without trouble. As you move south into France and Central Europe, the frequencies soften, often to the 60 to 80% range, with pockets lower or higher. Cross the Alps into parts of Italy, or travel east into the Balkans and Greece, and the ground shifts again. In some southern French and Italian populations, only about 40 to 60% of adults are lactose persistent. In certain Greek islands or Sardinian communities, estimates dip toward or below 20%. In some parts of Turkey, the frequencies can be even lower. The gradient is not perfectly smooth, but the trend is clear, a strong north-south decline. Underneath that map is a long, tangled history. The first Anatolian farmers moving into Europe, the existing hunter-gatherer groups they met and mixed with, later waves of herders and steppe pastoralists sweeping in from the east during the Bronze Age, plagues and famines and social changes in the late prehistoric and early historic periods. Each event shuffled genomes, shifted diets, and subtly changed what kinds of bodies had an advantage. In northern latitudes, where sunlight is weaker and winters are long, some researchers think that being able to drink fresh milk, with its combination of calcium and once fortified or consumed alongside other foods, vitamin D, might have been especially helpful for bones and overall health. Others point to milk as a relatively safe source of hydration and calories in crowded pathogen-rich settlements, or as a famine buffer when crops failed but herds survived. Whatever the exact mix of pressures, the numbers in the DNA tell us something simple but profound. In much of Europe, across a broad band of time from roughly the late Neolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages and into the medieval period, people with the minus 13,910 T allele had, on average, more surviving children than those without it, not because T made anyone stronger in every situation, or because milk was magic, but because in that changing ecological and cultural landscape, it tipped the balance often enough, over enough generations to matter. By the Middle Ages, when monks in monasteries brewed beers and copied manuscripts, they also churned butter and made cheese in great quantities. Towns and villages across northern Europe drank milk, ate cream-based porridges, and gave dairy to children and adults alike. By then, the story that Europeans can drink milk was becoming, in that region, less myth and more genetic reality. Even so, the Mosaic remained. A farmer in medieval Denmark and a shepherd in medieval Greece did not share the same odds of being lactase persistent. Their herding practices, their diets, their ancestral mixtures differed, and their genomes remembered. And beneath all of this, the debate continues. Exactly when did selection for lactase persistence in Europe really take off? Was it tied to specific climatic downturns and famines, to disease loads in dense farming villages, to the push into higher latitudes with weaker sun? Different studies give slightly different timelines, and new ancient genomes keep adding pieces to the puzzle. What is clear is that Europe's milk story is not a single moment, but a long unfolding, milk arriving with the first herds, being tamed through cheese and fermentation, by people whose guts still followed the old mammalian rule, and then, much later, a tiny T in a regulatory region surging through populations, turning a baby enzyme into a lifelong companion for the majority in some regions and a sizable minority in others. In the next part of our journey, we'll step back from the map and ask a harder question. What, exactly, made that tiny T so valuable that evolution grabbed it with both hands? When scientists saw how fast that tiny T spread, they didn't just shrug and move on. They asked a deeper question. What on earth was going on in those fields and villages and herding camps that made being able to drink raw milk so valuable? That evolution, usually so slow and patient, suddenly started sprinting. It's here that our story shifts from what happened to why it might have happened. The archaeological sherds and the ancient bones give us the outline. The details are filled in with models, with climate reconstructions, with educated guesses tested against the DNA. And, as with most things in human history, there isn't just one neat answer. Think of a medieval European landscape for a moment. Grey skies more often than not, long winters, short summers. Now imagine a body trying to grow in that world, a child's skeleton forming, vertebrae lengthening, legs stretching. To harden those bones, you need two things in particular: calcium and vitamin D to help your body use that calcium. Near the equator, strong sunlight striking your skin can manufacture plenty of vitamin D, but in northern latitudes where the sun stays low and weak for much of the year, that process slows down. Here enters the first theory, the calcium and vitamin D hypothesis. Milk carries a lot of calcium. It carries at least some vitamin D, especially in animals on certain diets. And lactose itself, the sugar that's so troublesome for most adult mammals, actually helps the gut absorb calcium more efficiently. If your intestines keep making lactase into adulthood, you can split that lactose into glucose and galactose, and instead of drawing water into your colon and causing diarrhea, it quietly boosts the uptake of those bone-building minerals. In a cloudy northern farming world where fish and other vitamin D-rich foods might be scarce, children who could fully digest milk may have been less likely to develop rickets, bowed legs, fragile bones, pelvic deformities. Adults might have been less prone to osteomalacia, the softening of bones that can make pregnancy and childbirth far more dangerous. Over many generations, even a small improvement in bone health could have enormous demographic consequences. A few more healthy births surviving, a few fewer women dying in childbirth from narrow, deformed pelvises, a few more children strong enough to weather infections and grow up to have kids of their own. Models that look at Northern Europe often find that something like this must have been in play. The selection pressure on lactase persistence is simply too strong to be explained by a mild advantage. It looks like the genetic equivalent of a life or death edge. But there's a problem if we try to make this the whole story. Strong selection for lactase persistence also shows up in places where sunlight is not especially scarce. Parts of Iberia, North Africa, the Middle East, and very clearly in certain African pastoralist groups living under intense sun. There, vitamin D from skin still comes easily. So while bone health may have helped push the T to high frequencies in cloudy northern skies, it can't be the only driver. To see another, you have to picture a different moment. Not a typical year, but a bad one. The rains don't come, or they come in the wrong season. Grain withers in the fields or rots. Stored supplies run low. In a farming village in late prehistory, famine isn't a metaphor, it's a season. Sometimes several in a row. Now imagine two families living side by side. Both own cattle or goats. Both have access to milk. But in one family, the adults and older children can drink that milk fresh and get every last calorie from it, fat, protein, and the full load of sugar. In the other, any attempt to drink raw milk in quantity leads to cramps, diarrhea, and dehydration. The adults have to rely on cheese and fermented products where bacteria have already eaten much of the lactose, or they have to risk sickness by drinking small amounts of fresh milk. In normal years, this difference might not matter much, but in a famine, when crops fail and the pantry empties, the gap widens into a chasm. The family with lactase persistence can turn every drop of milk into usable energy. The family without it wastes part of that resource and may lose children to the twin blows of malnutrition and disease. Recent work that compares ancient DNA with climate and archaeological indicators of stress finds something striking. The sharpest rises in the frequency of the European -13,910*T mutation don't line up simply with the earliest use of milk, but with later periods marked by population growth, crop failures, and high disease loads, times when people were crowded together, underfed, and beset by infections. Under those conditions, the advantage of being able to drink raw milk isn't just a matter of convenience. It becomes survival insurance. This is the famine buffering theory. Not that milk was always magical, but that in the worst years, it kept some lineages alive that would otherwise have ended in that season's hunger. There's another angle that looks less at calories and more at water itself. In early villages, where humans lived cheek by jowl with their livestock, rivers and ponds and wells can become dangerous. Human waste, animal waste, decaying matter, all of it finds its way into the same surface waters people drink from. Boiling can help, but fuel is precious, and not all cultures routinely boil drinking water. Fresh milk drawn from a healthy animal's udder, on the other hand, starts out relatively free of the pathogens that flourish in stagnant water. It is essentially a sealed, sterile liquid, produced inside the animal's body, then delivered directly into a container. For small children in particular, this matters enormously. Diarrheal diseases are among the biggest killers in pre-modern societies. A child who can hydrate on milk instead of contaminated water, and at the same time take in energy and nutrients, may stand a better chance in the invisible war against gut infections. If that child's body can also digest the lactose without producing its own debilitating diarrhea, the benefit doubles. No wasted water, no additional fluid loss, no compounding of illness. This clean fluid hypothesis fits well with what we know about settlements where people and animals share space, and with arid, pastoral landscapes where standing water is scarce and often suspect. In certain African and Middle Eastern herding societies, where milk can be the main drink for long periods and rivers may be seasonal or far away, the ability to rely on milk as both food and water would have been a powerful adaptation. Then there is the most straightforward idea of all, one that cuts across latitudes and climates. Milk is, quite simply, rich. It is a complete food designed by evolution to support rapid growth, fats to burn and store, proteins to build tissues, sugars for quick energy, plus a tapestry of vitamins and minerals. A cow, goat, camel, or sheep is a walking reservoir of this liquid, renewable resource. You don't have to kill the animal to access it. You just need the knowledge and the relationship that allows milking. In societies where herding becomes central, a lactose-persistent adult is like someone who carries an extra stomach. They can tap into a food source that never runs out as long as the herd survives. Even if they still use fermentation sometimes, the option to drink milk raw, in larger quantities, without severe symptoms, effectively increases their usable energy intake over the course of a year. Gene culture models of dairying suggest that this steady caloric surplus alone can drive strong selection. Families who can wring a little more energy and nutrition out of the same land and the same animals can raise more children to adulthood, support them through illnesses, and bounce back faster after bad years. When you put all these pieces on the table, better calcium and vitamin D handling at high latitudes, famine buffering in bad years, safer hydration in dirty or dry environments, and a general caloric advantage in herding economies, a pattern emerges. No single card explains the whole hand. Different regions would have weighted these advantages differently. In cloudy northern Europe, weak sun may have made bone health particularly important, especially as farming diets narrowed compared to hunter-gatherer menus. In the dry grasslands of East Africa or Arabia, water and reliable calories from milk would have loomed larger. In crowded Neolithic villages and Bronze Age towns, disease and famine may have been the main winds pushing the tea uphill. What ties them together is not one universal story, but a shared stage. Cultures that had already bound their survival to herds and flocks. Once humans began to shape their lives around animals that produced milk, evolution had something new to work with. The small accident that kept lactase turned on into adulthood wasn't just floating in a neutral sea. It was hooked into a system of milking, herding, sharing, and surviving. In one valley, in one century, the advantage might have been a healthier skeleton. In another, a drought where milk was the only safe drink. In a third, a blight that withered grain but left cows alive. Across thousands of years, these small local stories layered on top of each other. Each famine, each harsh winter, each disease season was another tap of the evolutionary hammer, and every time, in households where adults and older children could drain a bowl of fresh milk and walk away nourished instead of doubled over, the odds nudged ever so slightly in their favour. Multiply that by uncounted generations, and you get what we see today. Islands and ridges of lactase persistence scattered across the human map, each shaped by its own history of climate, culture, and crisis. In the next part of our journey, we'll leave Europe's cloudy fields and follow the herds south and east into Africa's savannas and deserts, where entirely different mutations rode on the backs of cattle, camels, and goats, weaving their own versions of the milk story into the human genome. The story of milk in Africa doesn't begin in a parched desert full of camels and thorn bushes. It begins in a place that, to our eyes, barely seems like the Sahara at all. Win the clock back 10,000 years. The world is easing out of the last ice age. Summer rains have drifted north, following slow wobbles in Earth's orbit. What is now a vast ocean of sand is a patchwork of lakes and green savannas. The green Sahara, picture it in the soft half-light before dawn. Grasses beading with dew, acacia trees throwing long shadows, herds of antelope and wild cattle moving cautiously to water. And along the edges of those lakes, small human camps, huts of brush, hearths ringed with stone, dogs stretched out, ears flicking at flies. At some point in this landscape, people began to do something new. Instead of only following wild herds, they started to keep a few animals close. Maybe it began with orphaned calves, maybe with half-tamed wild aurochs that found safety near human fires. However it started, by around 8,000 to 5,000 BCE, archaeological sites like Nabta Playa and others in the central Sahara show bones from cattle that don't quite look like those of wild beasts. Horn shapes, wear patterns, age profiles, all hint at human control. And up on sandstone cliffs and rock shelters, another record appears. Art. Thousands of years later, their colours are faded, but the scenes are still remarkably alive. Longhorned cattle with exaggerated, elegant curves, herders leading strings of animals, groups gathered around what might be enclosures, or water, or rituals. This is the Bovidian phase of Saharan rock art, and in some panels, figures kneel at the bellies of cows, hands outstretched as if milking. We can't be absolutely certain what each image meant to the people who painted it. Rock art is a window, not a photograph, but taken together, the cattle bones, the settlement patterns, the painted scenes, they point to a new way of life taking root. Pastoralism, humans and herds bound together. For a long time, this evidence was suggestive but indirect. Then chemistry added another layer. In what is now Libya, in the Tadra Takakis Mountains, archaeologists found fragments of pottery dating to around the 5th millennium BCE. When these sherds were tested in the lab, the microscopic fats soaked into their clay told a quiet but unmistakable story. The signature matched milk, not just animal fat in general, but the particular pattern of lipids formed when milk is warmed, processed, turned into something thicker, more stable, perhaps a kind of yogurt or soft cheese. Whatever exactly it was, people in the Green Sahara were not only keeping cattle by 5000 BCE, they were transforming their milk. And yet, as far as we can tell from later genetics, most of those early Saharan herders were almost certainly lactose intolerant as adults. Their bodies followed the default mammalian script: lactase in childhood, silence afterward. So, just as in early Europe and the Near East, culture came first. People learned to keep animals, to milk them, to tame the liquid with heat and bacteria, long before evolution rewrote the gene switch that keeps lactase flowing in adulthood. But Africa's story doesn't simply echo Europe's, it branches. Fast forward several thousand years, the Green Sahara dries, lakes shrink, then vanish, grasslands retreat. What was once a broad green corridor becomes the desert we know today. People and herds are pushed south and east, funneled into the Sahel, into the Nile Valley, into the highlands and rift valleys of East Africa. There, pastoralism doesn't fade. It intensifies. Among the peoples of what are now Kenya, Tanzania, Sudan, Ethiopia, Somalia and beyond, herding becomes a central pillar of life. Cattle, goats, camels, sometimes sheep, each adapted to different rainfall patterns and terrains, seasonal movements, long migrations, a calendar written in grass and water. In these societies, milk isn't a rare treat. It's a daily staple, sometimes the main food for months, mixed with blood drawn harmlessly from cattle veins, fermented into sour, thick drinks, dried into portable curds. Children are raised on it. Adults depend on it. Under these conditions, the same evolutionary logic that favoured milk drinkers in ancient Europe starts to operate again. Only this time, the solution in the DNA is different. When geneticists began to study East African pastoralists, groups like the Amasi, the Nuer, the Tutsi, the Beya and others, they expected perhaps to find the familiar European 13,910 T mutation near the LCT gene, the one that keeps lactase turned on. They did find it in some groups, often in those with histories of contact or mixture with Eurasian peoples. But they also found something far more intriguing. In several East African herders, adults who could happily drink raw milk carried no T at minus 13,910 at all. Instead, scattered in the regulatory region upstream of the lactase gene were other tiny switches, a C where most people have something else, a G in a different position, each one in roughly the same stretch of DNA that Europeans use, but at different addresses, variants at roughly minus 13,907, minus 13,915, minus 14,009, minus 14,010 base pairs from the start of the gene. In code form, you'll see them written as minus 13,907 *G, minus 13,915 *G, minus 14,009 *G, minus 14,010 *C. On the page, those labels look dry. Inside bodies, they mean this: keep the baby enzyme running. In Nilo-Saharan and Afro-Asiatic pastoralist groups in Kenya and Tanzania, the 14,010C variant can reach very high frequencies. Not every individual has it, and not every carrier is necessarily fully lactose persistent, but the pattern is striking. Among neighbours who don't herd, or who herd less intensely, the variant may be rare or absent. To the north and east, among Beja and related peoples who have herded along the Red Sea hills and Sudanese plains, Other variants like -13,907*G and -13,915*G turn up, again not randomly. They track the lines of cultures where milk is central. It is as if evolution, faced with the same cultural challenge, adults relying on milk, has tried several keys in the same lock in quick succession and found that more than one can open the door. Then there is the Fulani. Stretching across the Sahel from Senegal to Chad, the Fulani, or Fulbe, are one of the great pastoral peoples of West Africa. For centuries their identity has been woven tightly with cattle, mobile camps, seasonal grazing, herds that can number in the hundreds. In many Fulani communities, milk and milk products are at the heart of diet and economy. When researchers looked at their DNA, they found something unusual. The lactase persistence mutation that stands out most in many Fulani groups is not one of the East African variants. It's the European one, -13,910*T. In some studied Fulani populations, around a third to a half of people carry this T. That's very high for West Africa. Meanwhile, many of their farming neighbours, Dogon, Mandi speakers, and others whose livelihoods centre more on crops than on cattle, show much lower frequencies of the T, sometimes almost none. This suggests a complicated history. Gene flow at some point from groups carrying -13,910*T, perhaps from North Africa or the Mediterranean, blending into Fulani ancestors. Then, once those ancestors were living as dedicated herders, strong selection keeping that T and amplifying it, because in a milk-based life, it paid to have the baby enzyme stay on. If you zoom out and look at a map of lactase persistence across Africa today, you don't see a smooth gradient like temperature or rainfall. You see a mosaic. One pastoral group with high LP, perhaps 60, 70, even 80% of adults able to drink fresh milk. Just across a river, or over a low ridge, a farming community with the same sun overhead, the same soil underfoot, but LP rates of 10 or 15%, sometimes less. A hunter-gatherer community in the forest with almost none. A camel-herding group in the desert again with many. The boundaries between these groups are not drawn by climate. They're drawn by culture, by whether a people has spent centuries milking, herding, living off animals, or whether their main energy has come from grains, roots, wild game, fish, fruits. In some co-groups of southern Africa, there is evidence of East African-derived LP alleles, arriving along with a package of herding practices. In North Africa, Berber and Tuareg populations blend Saharan pastoral histories with Mediterranean influences. In each case, the genetic pattern echoes the history of cups and gourds and skins filled with milk, and even this mosaic is not fully mapped. When scientists sequence the DNA around the lactase gene in different African populations, they keep finding new variants, some rare, some localized, some not yet clearly tied to how much lactase a person actually makes. The catalogue is still incomplete. Africa, with its deep genetic diversity and incredibly varied cultures, is probably home to more milk-related mutations than we have names for yet. This uncertainty isn't a flaw in the story, it's part of its allure. In Europe, one major mutation dominates the map. In Africa, you have a constellation. Each tiny change in the code is like a pin marking where, at some point in the last few thousand years, culture and environment leaned hard on human bodies and whispered the same request: keep drinking. Sometimes evolution answered with a T at -13,910, sometimes with a C at -14,010, sometimes with a G a little closer to the gene. The details differ, but the principle is the same. Pastoralism didn't just shape landscapes and economies, it reached all the way into the genome, reshaping who could sip from a calabash of fresh milk without pain. When you picture Africa on the milk map, it's worth remembering this. There's no single African pattern of tolerance or intolerance. There are farmers whose bodies shut lactase off as expected, and herders whose bodies keep it flowing. There are city dwellers whose ancestors lived on fish and yams, and nomads whose lineages followed cattle tracks for 1,000 years. Side by side, in the same sun on the same earth, their genes tell different stories because their cultures wrote different scripts. In the next part of our journey, we'll follow those scripts as they cross the Red Sea and curve around the eastern edge of the Mediterranean into Arabia, the Levant and South Asia, regions where camels and goats and zebu cattle carried yet more variations on the milk mutation into the human story. The first people to carry those scripts out of Africa did not cross a wide ocean. They stepped over a narrow band of sea. Around 60,000 years ago, give or take, a few hundred descendants of those bottleneck survivors left northeastern Africa and moved into what is now the Arabian Peninsula. They were foragers then, not herders. The age of camels and corrals was still far in the future, but they carried in their bodies the same default setting as everyone else on Earth. Milk was for babies. Adults turned the enzyme off. Fast forward tens of thousands of years, the climate lurches through ice ages and interglacials. People in the Fertile Crescent begin to plant grains, to herd sheep and goats, to build the first villages of mud brick and packed earth. By around 8,500 years ago, early farmers in places like central Anatolia and northern Mesopotamia are milking their animals. We know this not from stories, but from chemistry. The same way Saharan pottery whispered milk, Neolithic sherds from the Near East do the same. The fats soaked into them match what you'd expect from processed milk, not just meat. Cows, sheep, goats, animals that could be eaten at once or tapped slowly, day after day, for their milk. You might expect, standing in this cradle of agriculture and early dairying, that the genes for lactase persistence would have flourished here first, sweeping across these river valleys like barley and wheat. The evidence suggests something stranger. When geneticists look at many present-day populations in the broader Middle East, in the Levant, in parts of Anatolia, in Mesopotamia's descendants, they see moderate to low levels of lactase persistence, not zero, not the high peaks of northern Europe or certain African herders. A patchwork of intermediate frequencies, and when ancient DNA is pulled from bones of early farmers in this same region, the story becomes clearer. For millennia after people began to milk animals here, most adults were still, genetically speaking, lactose intolerant. So how did they live with milk? They changed the milk, not themselves. The cultures of the Near East became masters of fermentation and transformation. Milk turned into thick yogurt, soured and stirred, into early cheeses strained through woven baskets or perforated pots, into clarified forms where the watery part rich in lactose was allowed to drain away or be boiled off. In these forms, the sugar that troubled adult guts was greatly reduced. Bacteria ate it, heat split it, slow draining carried it off. A bowl of yogurt or a crumbly cheese could be nourishing and relatively safe, even for bodies that shut down lactase in childhood. In that world, the advantage of carrying a lactase persistence mutation would still have existed. You could drink fresh milk straight from the animal. But it was a smaller edge. Where nearly everyone was already using low-lactose dairy, the pressure on evolution to find a genetic solution was gentler. So while dairying may have begun here early, the classic keep the enzyme on mutations never became overwhelming in the population. Culture softened the problem before genes were forced to. Yet the story does not stop in the river valleys. Turn your attention south and east, to the open, thirsty spaces of the Arabian Peninsula. Here, rainfall is fickle. Rivers are mostly dry. For people moving through these arid lands, animals that could carry water in their own bodies, travel long distances and eat sparse shrubs were precious. enter the dromedary camel. Camels were domesticated relatively late compared to cattle or sheep, probably around 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. But once people in Arabia learned to manage them, a new kind of pastoralism blossomed, one adapted to sand, scrub, and long horizons. Bedouin and related groups developed lifeways in which herds of camels and goats were central. Milk from these animals wasn't an occasional supplement. It was a sustaining staple, sometimes the main dependable source of fat and protein in a landscape that offered few alternatives. In such a setting, being able to drink raw camel or goat milk as an adult wasn't just convenient. It could be a matter of life and death. When scientists peered into the DNA of camel and goat-herding peoples of the Arabian Peninsula, especially nomadic Bedouin in places like Saudi Arabia, they found something striking, a different switch. Not the European minus 13,910 *T. Not the same variants that rose among East African cattle herders. Instead, a tiny change in the same regulatory neighbourhood upstream of the lactase gene, at a slightly different address, often written as minus 13,915 *G. On paper, again, a small substitution. In the body, another version of the same trick. Keep lactase turned on past childhood. In some of these desert pastoralist groups, the frequency of lactase-persistent adults can rise above 80%, as high or higher than many European populations. Among nearby non-pastoral communities, living more by farming or fishing or urban trades, the frequency drops. The pattern mirrors what we saw in Africa. Culture draws the map. The mutation follows. Genetic models suggest that this Arab Peninsula variant likely arose in or near Arabia itself and spread alongside dromedary and goat pastoralism, moving with tribes that crisscrossed the deserts, trading, raiding, and marrying across wide distances. On the African side of the Red Sea and in northeastern regions, related variants appear. G13907, C14010, each of them doing almost the same thing, each riding with a slightly different mix of cattle, goats, sheep, or camels, each rooted in communities for whom milk was central. As the desert caravans moved, genes and animals travelled together. Now let's follow another thread, further east, into South Asia. If you were to map the world today by milk-soaked traditions, India would glow brightly. Here, dairy is not just food, it is ritual, symbol, offering. Cows are sacred in many Hindu traditions, seen as givers of life, embodiments of abundance and non-violence. Milk and ghee are poured over statues of deities, butter lamps flicker in temples, sweets rich with koya and koa mark festivals and rites of passage. Long before the modern dairy industry, the subcontinent was shaping milk into a bewildering array of forms. Boiled milk, thickened and sweetened, ghee, the clarified butter fat almost entirely free of lactose, paneer, a fresh cheese made by curdling and draining, dahi or curd, a tangy yogurt, lassi, churned and often diluted. Archaeology suggests that zebu cattle were domesticated in the Indus Valley around 7,000 years ago, and water buffalo have also played a major role in milk production. Over time, India became one of the world's great dairy cultures. You might assume, then, that most people here can drink fresh milk without trouble. The genetics tell a more textured story. The main lactase persistence allele in South Asia is not a unique local invention. It is the same 13,910 *T variant that rose to prominence in Europe. In parts of northern India and Pakistan, especially among groups with a long history of pastoralism, or those historically linked to steppe-derived ancestry, the frequency of this T can reach roughly a quarter of all chromosomes. That might translate to something like 40 to 50% of adults able to digest lactose fully into adulthood. In many southern and eastern parts of India, by contrast, minus 13,910 T is much rarer, sometimes below 10%. There, the majority of adults will experience the typical decline in lactase after childhood. How can such a milk-saturated culture coexist with such varied genetic capacity? Again, by changing the milk. Boiling breaks down some lactose and alters how quickly it hits the gut. Fermentation into dahi and lassi lets bacteria do much of the digestive work before the person ever takes a sip. Turning cream into ghee removes almost all of the milk sugar, leaving a stable fat that can be stored for months and used in cooking and ritual. Paneer and other cheeses separate much of the lactose-rich whey from the solids. For a largely lactose-intolerant population, these techniques are like an external digestive system. The pots and cultures of bacteria and simple household steps stand in for the missing enzyme. Genetic studies suggest that the minus 13,910 T allele probably entered South Asia in larger amounts with steppe pastoralist migrations 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, then was favoured in some high dairy groups, communities like Gujars or Todas, where milk consumption is extraordinarily high. In such groups, lactase persistence can reach well over 80%. But for many others, the daily reality has been, you don't need the mutation to enjoy dairy, you just need the right recipes. If we step north again, onto the Central Asian steppe, the pattern repeats in yet another form. Mongolian and related nomadic cultures have, for centuries, lived in a world saturated with animal milk. Mare's milk, cow's milk, yak's milk, sheep's and goat's milk. For some herders, dairy has provided a third or more of all calories, especially in summer. Travellers' accounts are full of details, skins of airag or kumis, the sour, fizzy, mildly alcoholic drink made from fermented mare's milk, dense cheeses hung in the wind to harden, pastes of dried milk. And yet, when their DNA is examined, many of these populations show relatively modest frequencies of lactase persistence alleles, not the near-universal levels seen in some European or African herders, something lower, more mixed. The paradox dissolves when you look into the buckets. Almost all of this milk is fermented. Airag is alive with bacteria that devour lactose and turn it into acids and a little alcohol. Yogurts and hard cheeses do the same, letting microbes pre-digest the sugar. Dried curds concentrate protein and fat, while much of the lactose is left behind in the liquid that's discarded or used in limited ways. The steppe nomads solved the milk problem in the churn and the skin, not primarily in their genomes. Taken together, these regions, Arabian deserts, Levantine fields, South Asian plains, Central Asian grasslands, offer a kind of braided lesson. Again and again, humans found ways to live with milk. Sometimes, culture leapt first, inventing yogurts, cheeses, ghee, and fermented drinks that made dairy safer for bodies that had never read the genetic instructions for adult lactase. In those settings, the pressure on DNA was lighter. Lactase persistence mutations could appear and spread, but they did not have to conquer the population. Other times, especially where fresh milk was the only reliable food in harsh landscapes, evolution leaned in harder. Among Bedouin camel herders, East African cattle keepers, or certain Indian pastoral castes, carrying one of those tiny regulatory switches could mean the difference between thriving and constant discomfort. The result is a global patchwork, not a simple divide between milk peoples and non-milk peoples, but an intricate weaving of genetic adaptations and cultural techniques. A village that ferments everything and has low LP next to a community of raw milk herders with high LP. A religion that prizes ghee, a nearly lactose-free fat, in a population where many adults lack the enzyme. A nomad who drinks litres of fermented mare's milk daily, yet whose genes say, lactase off. When you next hear someone say, People from this region can't drink milk, or those people can drink as much as they like. It's worth remembering this deeper story. Our relationship with milk is not written by genes alone, nor by culture alone, but by the long, quiet conversation between them. In the next part of our journey, we'll travel further east and across oceans, to places where that conversation took a different turn, where entire civilizations built rich cuisines and thriving societies while leaving the lactase switch quite happily in its original baby-only position. If you follow that map of milk and genes further east, something curious happens. The bright zones of high lactase persistence that glow over parts of Europe, Arabia, and East Africa begin to fade. By the time you reach the great river valleys and coastlines of East and Southeast Asia, and then the forests and mountains of the Americas, the light is mostly gone. Not because people here were somehow left behind by evolution, because in these regions, evolution was never pushed to change. Imagine standing on the banks of the Yellow River 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. Early Chinese farmers are planting millet on the dry northern plains. Further south, in the wetter lands that will later carry rice paddies like mirrors, people are beginning to tame rice itself. They keep pigs and chickens close to their houses. Dogs dart between the dwellings. In some places, cattle and water buffalo graze the edges of fields, valued for meat, for muscle, for their ability to pull ploughs through sticky earth. But very rarely for their milk. Here, as agriculture matures, the basic problem of survival is solved without turning to the udder. Protein and fat come from pigs, fish, and later from soybeans. Carbohydrates from rice, millet, wheat, and tubers. Calcium and other minerals from vegetables, bones in broths, and mineral-rich water. The result, seen through the lens of genetics today, is stark. Across much of East Asia, among Han-Chinese, Koreans, Japanese, Vietnamese, Cambodians, and many other groups, the proportion of adults whose bodies keep lactase running is low. In many communities, fewer than 1 in 10 or 1 in 7 adults are fully lactase persistent. In some places, like parts of Korea or mainland Southeast Asia, the numbers dip so close to zero that, statistically speaking, almost everyone is following the ancestral pattern. Enzyme on in infancy, off in adulthood. If you grew up in these societies, that wasn't a problem. It was the norm. Traditional Chinese cuisine, for instance, simply did not revolve around cow's milk. For most of the imperial history, fresh milk and cheese were foods associated with steppe nomads, the barbarians to the north and west, rather than the settled farmers of the Central Plains. Instead, a different kind of milk emerged. Soybeans were domesticated early in North China. At some point, probably more than 2,000 years ago, people discovered that if you soak and grind these beans, then boil and strain the slurry, you get a pale, cloudy liquid, soy milk. If you curdle that liquid and press it, you get tofu. Here was a pair of foods that nutritionally did many of the same things as dairy, rich in protein, containing fats and minerals, able to be flavoured and cooked in countless ways. But they were born from beans, not from animals, no lactose, no need for lactase. Over centuries, soy milk, dujiang or dunai, and tofu wove themselves into daily life. Breakfast stalls steaming in winter, bowls of warm soy milk beside fried dough. Cubes of tofu simmered with vegetables, minced meat or fermented sauces. Braised, dried, smoked, silken, firm. 1,000 textures, all lactose-free. In Japan, miso and tofu. In Korea, doenjang and dubu. Across Southeast Asia, tempeh, fermented soy pastes and other bean-based foods followed parallel paths. Legumes, grains, and small amounts of meat or fish formed a kind of nutritional triangle that made cow's milk unnecessary. Without a cultural habit of milking animals, there was no strong evolutionary reward for keeping lactase switched on. If a mutation allowing adult milk drinking did appear now and then, it would drift in the population like any other harmless variant, useful only on rare occasions, never demanded by daily life. That long history shaped bodies quietly. Today, when doctors run breath tests or genetic screens, they find that in many East Asian populations, 80 to 90% of adults show lactose malabsorption. When they drink a big glass of unfermented cow's milk, the sugar moves undigested into the colon. Bacteria celebrate, gas, cramps, and discomfort follow. For thousands of years, almost nobody did that. The turning point comes surprisingly late. Only in the 20th century, especially after wars, revolutions, and waves of globalization, do governments and nutritionists in places like Japan, South Korea, and China begin promoting cow's milk on a mass scale. School milk programs, powdered milk in relief shipments, posters reminding parents that milk makes strong bones. Supermarkets fill with cartons and yogurts and ice cream. Dairy becomes aspirational, modern, tied to Western lifestyles. In China, for much of the 20th century, fluid cow's milk is talked about explicitly as a foreign food, imported not just as a product, but as a symbol of progress. As more people start drinking it, another realization spreads alongside the taste for cream and cheese. A lot of us don't digest this very well. Lactose intolerance becomes a familiar phrase, a shared joke, a small annoyance blamed on individual bodies, even though in evolutionary terms those bodies are simply doing what human bodies have always done. If you sailed east across the Pacific before Columbus, you would have found a similar story playing out under different stars. In the Americas, societies blossomed in deserts, rainforests, mountain valleys, and endless grasslands. They domesticated crops that would transform the world: maize, potatoes, cassava, beans, squash, chilies, cocoa. They built cities of stone and earth: Teotihuacan, Tenochtitlan, Cusco, Cahokia. They tamed animals too: llamas and alpacas in the Andes, turkeys in Mesoamerica, guinea pigs in the highlands, dogs almost everywhere, but not cattle, sheep, goats, or camels. And crucially, almost none of these New World domesticates were regularly milked. A llama can produce milk, of course. All mammals do. But traditional Andean cultures used llamas primarily as pack animals and for meat and wool. There's little evidence of any sustained milking tradition before European contact. In this world of maize and beans, potatoes and quinoa, fish and game, no one leaned on animal milk to feed children after weaning or to survive lean seasons. There were other solutions: nixtamalized corn that unlocked more nutrients, combinations of grains and legumes that together provided all the essential amino acids, terraced fields capturing every drop of mountain rain. Under these conditions, keeping lactase into adulthood conferred no special advantage. It would be like having a key to a door no one ever tried to open. When geneticists and physiologists later measured lactose digestion among indigenous American groups, they found the familiar ancestral pattern. In many communities with mostly native ancestry, 80% or more of adults show lactose non-persistence. Breath tests, stool tests, and genetic markers all point in the same direction. Again, this is not a flaw. It is what our species did for almost its entire history. The disruption here comes violently. After 1492, European colonists bring cattle, sheep, goats, and their dairying habits. They also bring their lactase persistence alleles, especially the European -13,910*T mutation. Over centuries, forced migrations, intermarriage, and demographic collapse mix these genes with indigenous and African ancestries. Today, in many parts of Latin America and North America, the picture is complicated. Some people of mixed heritage carry LP mutations and drink milk comfortably. Others, particularly where indigenous ancestry is higher, do not. Yet cow's milk has become woven into cuisines and economies: quesos and ice creams, dairy farms and powdered milk programs. For many native communities, though, the baseline remains similar to what it was before contact: adult bodies that naturally turn lactase down, living in a world increasingly saturated with a food they did not evolve around. Seen from above, the distributions can look like a judgment: high lactase persistence in some regions, low in others, as if evolution were handing out favours unevenly. But the deeper story is gentler. The lactase-off pattern is the original human condition. It is the setting tested and maintained over hundreds of thousands of years, from the bottleneck survivors in Africa to the first foragers in every new land they entered. Only in certain corners of the world, where milk became not just an extra but a daily pillar of survival, did evolution tweak the switch. In East Asia, in the Americas, and in many Pacific and Southeast Asian islands, people solved nutrition in other ways. Grains, legumes, fish, tubers, nuts, and non-dairy animal fats carried them through. Fermentation and cooking and clever combinations of plants provided what was needed. They never fell behind on the road to milk. They simply walked a different road. So when you hear that most East Asians are lactose intolerant, or that many Native Americans can't drink milk, it is worth translating the phrase in your mind. Not defective, just ancestral. Bodies still tuned to a world before herds and cheese, a world where the only milk that mattered was the first kind any of us ever taste, the kind that comes from a parent's body in the early months of life, and then, quite naturally, fades away. From there, everything else, the pastures, the churns, the mutations, is a local experiment. In the next part of our journey, we'll step back from these local experiments and look at the modern map as a whole, a world in which a bedtime glass of milk can be comfort for some, discomfort for others, and a quiet reminder for all of us of the long, winding history written into our genes and our kitchens. If you could hold the planet in your hands and slowly turn it in the dark, the old maps of empire and religion would fade away. In their place, another pattern would appear. Pale bands here, darker patches there. A ghostly overlay that doesn't care about borders, only about biology and history. This is the modern milk map, not of cows and cartons, but of enzymes and ancestors. On this map, most of the world is shaded. Roughly 2 out of every 3 adults on Earth, about 65 to 70%, have what doctors call lactose malabsorption, which simply means this: after a certain age, their small intestine no longer makes much lactase. The sugar in milk passes through mostly undigested, but that doesn't mean 2/3 of humanity collapses if they touch an ice cream cone. Because in the real world, milk isn't a yes or no story, it's a spectrum. Start in Northern Europe, where the light is brightest on the genetic map. In parts of Ireland, Scandinavia, the British Isles, and the North Sea coasts, 8 or 9 out of 10 adults carry lactase persistence variants. The European 13,910 T-switch is common here. For many people in these regions, a big glass of cold milk in adulthood feels as ordinary as breathing. Yet even inside Europe, the glow fades, moves south toward Italy, Greece, parts of the Balkans. Cross eastward into some Slavic countries. The proportion of adults who keep lactase running drops. In several southern and eastern regions, tests suggest that well over half of adults have some degree of lactose malabsorption. In some pockets, the numbers creep towards 70% or more. So the stereotype, Europeans can all drink milk, dissolves on contact with reality. Even within a single country, ancestry matters. A German city might have one neighbourhood where most people of northern heritage digest milk easily, and another where recent migrants from West Africa or East Asia experience symptoms with just half a cup. Shift your gaze across Eurasia. In many parts of East and Southeast Asia, the old ancestral pattern dominates. 80, sometimes 90% of adults show lactose malabsorption on breath tests. In much of China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and neighbouring regions, lactase persistence is the exception, not the rule. But again, it's not absolute. There are communities with steppe ancestry, or long histories of dairying, where the numbers look different. There are individuals whose genes or microbiomes give them more leeway. Saying Asians can't drink milk erases these gradients and flattens thousands of years of diverse food traditions into a single, inaccurate line. The Americas add another layer. Among many indigenous groups, especially where native ancestry remains high, lactose malabsorption is common, often above 80%. In these communities, bodies still largely follow the pre-dairy script, but centuries of mixing with European and African lineages have created a patchwork. In some Latin American populations, European-derived lactase persistence alleles are frequent. In others, indigenous ancestry predominates. Two people growing up on the same street, eating the same school lunches, may have utterly different experiences with that carton of milk. Even small islands carry distinct signatures. In some Pacific populations, primary lactase persistence is rare. In others, particularly where herding or imported dairying took hold, it's more common. Globalization then pours supermarket milk over all of these underlying patterns at once. From a distance, it's tempting to divide the world into tolerant and intolerant zones. But that's not how bodies actually work. Doctors make a useful distinction here. Lactose malabsorption is about what happens in your gut. Your small intestine no longer produces enough lactase, so some lactose travels onward to the large intestine. There, bacteria feast, producing gas and short-chain acids. Lactose intolerance is about what you feel: bloating, cramps, diarrhea, rumbling, discomfort. You can have malabsorption without many symptoms. You can also have significant symptoms at one time in your life and fewer at another, depending on how much lactose you consume, what else you eat, and what your microbiome is doing. For many adults with reduced lactase, the body can still quietly handle modest doses. 1 cup of milk, around 12 grams of lactose, taken with a meal, moves more slowly through the stomach and small intestine. The existing lactase has more time to work. The bacteria in the colon receive a manageable trickle rather than a flood. In clinical studies, many people who fail a lab test can still drink this amount with only mild or no symptoms. Context matters. Drinking a large glass of milk on an empty stomach is not the same as eating cheese and yogurt with bread and vegetables. Hard cheeses often contain very little lactose. Yogurt comes with bacteria that help pre-digest the sugar. A bowl of rice and beans with a small dollop of sour cream feels different to your gut than a sugar-loaded milkshake. Over time, even your microbiome can adapt. If you introduce small amounts of lactose regularly, some colonic bacteria can shift their metabolism, turning lactose into useful energy instead of just gas. The gut, like culture, learns. A different story entirely hides beneath a similar label: milk allergy. This is not about enzymes. It is about the immune system misidentifying proteins in milk, casein, whey, as dangerous invaders. The responses can range from hives and vomiting to difficulty breathing, and in severe cases, anaphylaxis. Milk allergy is most common in infancy and early childhood. Many children outgrow it by school age. It isn't dose-dependent in the same gentle way. A tiny amount can trigger a big reaction, and no amount of getting used to it or changing your microbiome will make it safe. So when someone says, "I'm allergic to milk," they're describing something very different from the slow, bacterial drama of lactose intolerance. One is a digestive mismatch. The other is an immune alarm. In a way, our modern world has answered both stories with new versions of an old trick. Ancient people learned to ferment milk into cheese, yogurt, kefir, to let microbes transform lactose into lactic acid, to reduce the sugar that caused trouble. They invented technologies of clay pots, animal skins and controlled cultures. Today, factories do something similar with stainless steel and precision. Lactose-free milk on a supermarket shelf is just regular milk with added lactase. The enzyme breaks the sugar down into glucose and galactose before you ever open the carton. To your small intestine, that glass looks like it has already been digested. Lactase tablets and drops in a pharmacy extend the same principle into your pocket. A pill swallowed with the first bite of ice cream stands in for the gene switch some of your ancestors never needed. It's a tiny personal act of biotechnology, continuing a 10,000-year tradition of bending milk to fit human bodies. Around this biology curls another layer: culture and politics. For much of the 20th century, especially in Europe and North America, dairy was promoted as a near-universal good. School milk programs handed out cartons as symbols of health and modernity. Nutritional guidelines spoke of 3 servings of dairy a day as if this were a neutral, globally applicable standard. But remember the map. When a guideline built around Northern European biology is exported to countries where 70, 80, 90% of adults naturally reduce lactase, something strange happens. A food that the majority of local bodies cannot fully digest is marketed as essential, and people whose digestion follows the ancestral pattern are told, implicitly or explicitly, that their guts are the problem. In response, some governments have begun to adjust, offering lactose-free options in school programs, emphasizing other sources of calcium and protein, recognizing that healthy looks different when your population's evolutionary path never depended on herds and churns. On the personal level, the politics are quieter. In many families, one sibling can drink milk without thinking, while another plans around it. One parent reaches for yogurt at night, another for soy milk or oat milk or no milk at all. Each body is a small archive of migrations and marriages, of which ancestors needed lactase and which did not. Your gut microbiome adds a final, intimate script. The trillions of microbes living along your intestine were shaped by your childhood diet, your environment, your antibiotics, your infections. They help decide whether a little lactose slides by unnoticed or becomes an evening of discomfort. So that simple bedtime glass, the cliché of warm milk to help you sleep, is never just simple. For some people, it is a direct line back to cold pastures and snow-bright nights, to ancestors who survived on milk when crops failed. For others, it is a foreign habit, adopted only recently, sitting a bit uneasily on a body tuned to grains, beans and broths. And for many, it is something negotiated. A smaller cup, milk folded into porridge, a switch to yogurt or cheese, a pill slipped discreetly before dessert, or a different ritual altogether: tea, herbal infusions, a bowl of caldo, a piece of fruit. In that sense, the modern milk map is not just painted on a globe in a textbook. It is traced every evening in kitchens and bedrooms all over the world as people choose what to pour, what to avoid, what to enjoy, and what to risk. Each of those choices is a quiet conversation between genes and culture, between ancient mutations and modern technologies, between what your ancestors needed to survive and what you happen to like the taste of tonight. In the final part of our journey, we'll step back one more time and look at the larger pattern behind all of this. How a single baby enzyme kept running in a few scattered populations became a window onto the deep relationship between our cultures, our genomes, and the foods we build our lives around. If you zoom out far enough, that bedtime glass of milk stops being a question about your stomach and turns into a question about how evolution really works for our species. Because lactase persistence isn't just a quirky digestive trait. It's one of the clearest, sharpest examples we have of culture reaching back into the genome and changing it. For almost all mammals, and for almost all of human history, the rule was simple. Babies drink milk, Adults don't. The enzyme turns off, the gene quiets down, and life moves on. Then, around 10,000 years ago, some humans started doing something very strange in evolutionary terms. They took the milk of other animals and poured it into adult bodies, day after day, year after year, generation after generation. They weren't changing their DNA, they were changing their culture. But that new culture created a new pressure, a new filter. In those herding, dairying communities, adults who, by chance, carried gene switches that kept lactase running had a small advantage. On days when the harvest failed, when the wells were foul, when disease stalked the village, they could lean more heavily on milk. They could squeeze a few extra calories, a little more protein, a safer drink out of the herd. Those tiny advantages add up when you stack them over centuries. In Northern Europe, genetic studies suggest that one particular change, a single nucleotide switch upstream of the LCT gene, the famous 13,910T variant, went from almost non-existent to very common in just a few thousand years, roughly 400 generations, a blink in evolutionary time. To get that kind of rise, selection has to be strong. It means that, in at least some times and places, people who carried that variant had noticeably more surviving children than those who didn't. Not because they were better in any absolute sense, but because in a world of famines, parasites and cold, the ability to drink raw milk as an adult sometimes made the difference. And this didn't happen only once. In East Africa, among pastoralist groups whose lives revolve around cattle, camels or goats, researchers have found a whole cluster of different mutations near the same lactase gene. They sit in slightly different positions, with labels like -13,907, -13,915, -14,010. Each one is a separate tweak to the same regulatory switch. In parts of the Middle East and the Arabian Peninsula, yet other variants appear in the same neighborhood. Different peoples, different histories, different herds, zebu cattle on African savannas, goats and sheep in Middle Eastern hills, camels in Arabian deserts. But the logic is the same. Where culture built a way of life around milk, evolution tuned the genome in response. That feedback loop has a name: gene-culture coevolution. It isn't unique to milk. Milk is just the case where the trail of evidence is unusually clear. From animal bones in ancient settlements, to milk fats soaked into pottery, to DNA pulled from 5,000-year-old skeletons that still carried the childhood-only version of the gene. When scientists call lactase persistence a textbook example, this is what they mean. You can watch culture and genes leaning on each other in real time. The pattern shows up again in other corners of the body. Think about starch. Long before refrigerators and supermarkets, some communities lived in landscapes rich in tubers, grains and roots. Others did not. Over the last 12,000 years, as agriculture spread, some populations came to rely heavily on rice, wheat, maize, potatoes, and yams. Starch became the backbone of daily calories. In response, something subtle happened in their saliva. Humans carry a gene called AMY, one that makes salivary amylase, an enzyme that starts breaking down starch the moment food touches your tongue. Unlike the lactase story, this one isn't about a simple on-off switch. It's about copy number. Some people carry only a few copies of the AMY1 gene, others carry many. On average, groups with long histories of high-starch diets, Japanese rice farmers, some European agricultural populations, certain hunter-gatherers who dig a lot of roots, tend to have more copies. Their saliva is richer in amylase, better at liquefying a mouthful of rice or bread into simple sugars. Groups whose recent ancestors relied more on meat, milk, or fish often have fewer copies. Again, culture shifts first. People plant fields, grind grains, dig tubers. Then natural selection, working quietly in the background, nudges the genome to match the new menu. Alcohol tells a related story. For tens of thousands of years, humans have been fermenting sugars into drinks, from rice beers and millet brews to grape wine and honey mead. In some parts of the world, fermented beverages became deeply woven into ritual, economy, and everyday life. In others, alcohol stayed rare or came late. In East Asia, many populations carried distinctive versions of genes like ADH, 1B and ALDH2, which control how fast alcohol and its byproducts are broken down. Some of these variants speed up the first step and slow down the second, leading to a rapid spike in a toxic intermediate. The result is familiar: the flushing face, pounding heart, and discomfort some people feel after just a little alcohol. Those reactions aren't just bad luck. They're part of an evolutionary story in which centuries of exposure to alcohol, changing disease environments, and cultural drinking patterns push gene frequencies around. The exact reasons are still debated: protection against alcoholism, defense against certain pathogens. But the pattern of culture and genes shaping one another is there. High in the Himalayas, another layer appears. On the Tibetan plateau, where the air is thin and oxygen scarce, people live year-round at altitudes that leave many visitors gasping. Genetic work suggests that one of the key adaptations, a variant in a gene called EPAS1 that fine-tunes the body's response to low oxygen, likely came from an ancient cousin, the Denisovans, through interbreeding tens of thousands of years ago. For millennia, that variant sat in the gene pool, doing little. Then, when humans began to settle permanently at high altitude, a new cultural choice met an old genetic possibility. Suddenly, people carrying the Denisovan-derived EPAS1 had a clear advantage. Their blood didn't thicken as much. Their children survived pregnancy and infancy more often. Over relatively few generations, the variant spread through Tibetan populations. Ancient encounters, recent lifestyles. Once again, the same theme. What we do, where we live, what we eat, how we farm, what we ferment, writes itself into which genes thrive. Milk is just the part of that pattern that most of us can feel immediately, in our own bodies, with a single sip. What makes the milk story especially powerful right now is how much detail we're starting to see. Every year, more ancient genomes are sequenced. Skeletons from Neolithic villages, Bronze Age herder graves, medieval cemeteries, bits of DNA extracted from teeth, from petrous bones in the inner ear, from tiny fragments you could balance on a fingertip. When scientists line those genomes up by age and place, they can watch the lactase persistence variants move. In early European farmers, even where pottery holds chemical traces of milk, the adult drinking alleles are rare. Thousands of years later, in the same regions, they're common. In some African pastoralist groups, different lactase persistence mutations rise and fall on their own schedules, tracking the spread of cattle, camels, or goats across the landscape. Each new data set sharpens or complicates the picture. Sometimes it confirms older ideas, that selection was very strong, that the main European allele surged within about 5,000 to 7,000 years. Sometimes it overturns them, showing, for example, that in certain areas people were deeply invested in dairying long before any known lactase persistence variant was common, relying on fermentation and cheese-making to cope. What began as a simple story, some people evolved to drink milk, becomes a tapestry of local histories, each with its own timeline, its own mix of culture and chance. And threaded through all of it is a quieter, more philosophical question. What does it mean that your body tonight is partly the outcome of decisions made by people who never knew you would exist? A herder on a windy steppe, choosing to follow the rains with their cattle instead of settling down with crops. A village on a riverbank trying a new grain, planting field after field of it until starch became the cornerstone of their diet. a community experimenting with fermenting fruits or grains into drink, then weaving those brews into ceremony and trade, a small band deciding to stay on a high plateau, to raise children in thin air where the stars feel close and the winters bite hard. None of them were thinking, this will change the frequency of a particular allele in my descendants. They were thinking about tomorrow's meal, next year's drought, the neighbouring clan, the spirits of place and sky. Yet across thousands of years those practical choices carved channels in the human gene pool. They favoured some variants, disfavoured others, and gradually, quietly altered what bodies could do. Lactase persistence is one of the cleanest windows into that process. A baby enzyme that, in a few places, never shuts off. A cultural habit. Milking animals. That turn that quirk into an advantage. A rapid sweep through certain populations, leaving a distinctive pattern on the modern milk map. But even if your ancestors never herded cattle, even if you wince at the thought of a tall glass of milk, you're part of the same larger story. Your ability to handle starch, your reaction to alcohol, the way your blood responds to altitude, your immune system's quirks, all of these carry echoes of old landscapes, old diets, old ways of life. Tonight, whether you're sipping warm milk, avoiding it carefully, or choosing something entirely different, your body is doing its quiet work according to instructions written over many generations. Some instructions were shaped by plagues and ice ages. Some were nudged by clay pots filled with fermenting milk, by grinding stones and brewing vats, by corrals and terraces and boats. You do not need to think about any of this for your enzymes to switch on, for your gut to decide what to do with what you swallow, but you can, if you like, let the thought drift across your mind as you fall asleep, that inside every cell, in spirals of DNA too small to see, is a history book your ancestors wrote with their lives, with the plants they sowed, the animals they tamed, the mountains they climbed, and the milk they chose to drink or to leave untouched. In a moment, we'll close our journey with one last reflection. For now, let that bigger picture settle around you. A world where culture and genes are always talking to each other, and you are the latest chapter in that long unfinished conversation. So now, at the end of this long arc, come back to that simple scene. You, a quiet room, maybe a soft blanket, maybe a glass of something on the bedside table, milk or tea or just water. Behind that small moment sits 10,000 years of history. Once there was a world where no adult human could truly drink milk without paying for it. Lactase was a baby enzyme switched on for infancy and then gently dimmed. The rule was the same for us as for almost every other mammal. Weaning meant the end of milk. Then came herds. People began to walk beside cattle and goats and sheep, to sleep within earshot of their breathing, to time their journeys to the rhythm of grass and rain. Someone, somewhere, tried milking these animals not just for their children, but for themselves. Bodies weren't ready. So cultures adapted first. Milk was curdled, soured, fermented, turned into cheese, yogurt, kefir, butter. Each process a tiny bit of biotechnology, designed to strip away lactose and leave behind fat, protein and calories that mostly lactose-intolerant adults could manage. For thousands of years that was the compromise. Then, in a few scattered populations, genes began to answer culture's call. In one place, a single base in the DNA sequence flipped near the lactase gene, the -13,910*T variant that would sweep across parts of Europe with astonishing speed. In other regions, different mutations arose upriver of the same gene, -13,907 here, -13,915 there, -14,010, -14,009 and others, appearing in pastoralist groups in East Africa, the Middle East, the Arabian Peninsula. Different languages, different rituals, different animals on the horizon line, but the same underlying pattern, a way of life built around milk creating a quiet but relentless pressure. Adults who could drink it had just enough extra resilience in hard years that, over a few thousand years, their descendants began to dominate the gene pool. Out of that process came the modern Mosaic. In parts of northern and central Europe, the vast majority of adults now carry lactase persistence variants. In much of East Asia, in many indigenous American communities, in large stretches of Africa and southern Europe, most adults remain lactose intolerant or close to it. Between those poles lie countless shades of grey, people who can handle cheese but not fresh milk, yogurt but not ice cream, a splash in tea but not a full glass. No one pattern is normal. All of them are local answers to local histories. So wherever you are tonight on that spectrum, happily sipping dairy, avoiding it on your doctor's advice or simply not interested, your body is one particular way of solving an ancient problem. How to eat, how to drink, how to survive in the place your ancestors called home. If you've stayed with this story all the way to the end, thank you. You chose to spend a piece of your evening wandering from Ice Age hunters to Neolithic herders, through clay pots lined with milk fat, past cheese strainers buried for 7,000 years, into the tangle of gene switches and ancient DNA, and back out again to the modern world's patchwork milk map. That time, that attention, is something you could have given to 1,000 other things. I'm grateful you spent it here. If you found this journey calming, or interesting, or quietly companionable as you drift towards sleep, you can gently let the algorithm know by liking the video. If you'd like to wander through more late-night histories about genes or empires or forgotten worlds, you can subscribe so the next story finds its way to you. In the comments, if you feel like sharing, you're welcome to leave a note about where you're listening from. A city apartment, a dorm room, a farmhouse, a barracks bed, a cabin under winter snow, a small room somewhere on the night side of the planet. Over time, those little messages become their own kind of map, not of who can drink milk, but of where this story reached you. If you want to support the channel a bit more directly, there is also a membership option. Members help keep these long, quiet explorations possible. The research, the writing, the steady trickle of new episodes. It's there for those who are curious and able, but it is completely optional. Watching, listening, drifting off with the story is already a gift. For now, you don't need to do anything at all. You can let your thoughts soften and wander. Maybe picture an ancient night far from here, a small fire on an open plain, a herd sleeping nearby, the soft clink of a clay pot set down carefully on the ground. Above, the same stars that hang over you now. Around that fire, people whose names are lost, but whose choices still echo faintly in your cells. They worried about their own tomorrows. You are their distant future. As you lie there, your heart keeping its slow rhythm, your breath rising and falling on its own, all those old stories are still moving quietly inside you, in enzymes and blood cells, in bones and brain. You don't have to hold any of it. You can let the past recede into a comfortable blur, like hills vanishing in mist. Let your jaw unclench. Let your shoulders sink an inch deeper into whatever is supporting you. Let your eyes grow heavy. Whether you drink milk or leave it untouched, whether your ancestors herded cattle or never saw one, you are part of this long, intricate, unfinished conversation between culture and genes, chance and choice. Tonight that conversation can go on without you for a while. You have done enough. Rest well, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be gentle and just a little bit filled with old fires, quiet herds, and the soft, steady work of time.